Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, Bob and Gannon and Alex. I didn't get to physically just talk to you, but all nice to see you.
We do have a lot of folks online today.
Good.
Great. So
Hi, everybody who's online.
can everyone online hear us okay?
Yep. Sounds good.
Amazing. Thank you. Well, I expect that folks will continue to. Yes, we are recording. Okay, are recording. Okay. Well, thank you all again for being here today. I expect folks will continue filing in. We have a number of folks online today, both TAC members and just members of the public. So thank you everyone for joining us. I'm going to do just a quick run through of the agenda, what we're up to today, and then Trey will kind of take us through our first discussion after that. So wanted to just start with a quick reminder, or just a quick run through of today's agenda. So we'll start with introductions. I think at this point we all know each other pretty well, but do you think there's value in doing quick TAC member introductions?
Quick hello from TAC members and supporters who are here today and online, just so we have a sense of everybody who knows who's here.
Okay. Why don't we take a minute and do that
ahead,
real quick? Okay. So I am Annie Decker. I'm with VCP. I've been involved in this phase 2 of Act 59, kind of developing this plan and getting it ready for delivery to the legislature on June 30th.
Well, Gunnar Army with FPR. I've been supporting Act 59 throughout both phases and excited that we're getting near the finish line.
Becca Washburn, also with Forest Parks and Recreation.
Isaac Bassell with BHCB.
Emily Alger with the Center for Whole Communities.
Ari Rockman-Miller with the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets.
Alex Smith with Backcountry Hunters and Anglers.
Krista Carlson, Thetford Conservation Commission.
Bob Zano, Vermont Fish and Wildlife.
Ian Osborne, the Nature Conservancy. Well, Zine, Isal, and Day was Hashtag, Alex Bucky, Miao, Noble Banaki. I'm Paul Rich, I'm down in Brattleboro. I represent the Vermont Commission on Native American Affairs.
Hi, everybody. Before we go online, I'm Trey Martin from the Housing and Conservation Board.
And TAC members who are online, would you like to introduce yourself as well, just very briefly?
Hi, everybody. Kate Poor, Vermont Woodlands Association.
I'll go next. I'm Hannah Sessions. I'm the farmer member doing farming.
I'm happy to jump in. I'm Nick Bennett. I'm the chair of the Vermont Trails and Greenways Council and the executive director of the Vermont Mountain Bike Association.
I'll jump in. Chris Castano with Maine Woods Company.
This is Jamie Fidel with Audubon, Vermont. I'll be there in just a couple of minutes, just in transit from a dentist appointment. See you soon.
Remember to floss.
Feeling fresh.
Any other TAC members online? All right, well.
Oh, sorry. I was really slow to get to the thing. This is Jean Hamilton, Land Access and Opportunity Board. And yeah, really excited to be with you all again today.
Hi, Jean.
Hi, Jean.
Thank you all for being here with us today.
So to dive in, the first 2 agenda items are kind of, are you ready for me to dive into that? Agenda items?
I'm happy to do a quick.
Okay, go ahead.
Over. Yeah, I'll do very high level summary and then you take it.
Perfect.
Okay. So I'll just do a quick overview of kind of what's coming next for the TAC, and we'll look at that project timeline again quick together and just kind of anchor ourselves. Where are we right now? What's to come? Our discussion today in the first part will be about what we are hearing in the listening sessions taking place around the state, but we also really want to hear from TAC members what you are hearing as well. I think a number of you have now hosted meetings, been on meetings. I'm sure you've heard from your communities a bit more, so we want to leave some space for that conversation. We'll have public comment, we'll take a little break. And then the second discussion today will really be digging into those high level themes of kind of what are we hearing in these listening sessions and how do we really start thinking about moving towards implementation of this plan? What are the pieces that that need to kind of come together to make this plan really come together and be developed and then implemented. We'll have another round of public comment, another break, and then we'll have lunch at noon again. And we are hoping to have a discussion over the lunch hour. Might not take the whole hour, but we want to really continue to discuss as we are now out around the state, having these conversations with communities. How do we take those relationships that we're working on and building and bringing together and carry those forward as well as we implement this plan? And I think that's a lot of what we want to keep talking about with the TAC over the next few months. So high level, what to expect today. And then a quick reminder of our upcoming meetings. So just 3 more meetings after today of the TAC. Our April meeting will be another remote online meeting completely on Zoom. In May, we'll get back together here in this space for one last in-person meeting as a TAC. And then we'll have a June remote meeting as well. Unless something dramatically changes, which we will communicate to you all, this is the plan for the TAC for wrapping up these plans. And we did just want to share again the timeline slide. We've shared this a few times now, but just kind of again, where are we right now? We are at this now TAC March 19th meeting. And I think, Trey, you can kind of give us an overview of what else is happening, what's to come, and how do we get to the end of this project.
Great, thank you. I was so excited to talk about that I get ahead of you. But it is really nice to see you all. It's nice to just it does feel like we're gathering momentum and hearing from lots and lots of people. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. And by the way, I think the next 2 kind of agenda items sort of conflate. So Roman numeral 2 and Roman numeral 3. We need to have a quick update. We'll talk a little bit about the document that I sent, but then, as Andy said, we want to start off by just adding, we tried to describe what we're hearing, but it may not be exactly what you're hearing. So if you notice that the document we sent out says draft on it in 4 separate places, because it's not the final conclusions of VCP, but it was an attempt to stimulate a conversation today. But anyways, we finished. We had 5 regional listening sessions hosted in conjunction with regional partners around the state. In February, we had the last one in March, and then we had an online session for people who weren't able to travel to a location. While we were hosting those sessions, we had put out the RFP for the stakeholder-led listening sessions. We awarded 28 grants for that, and awarded between $1,000 and $4,000 to the grantees, depending on what they asked for. And it seems like we're about halfway through those in terms of ones that stakeholders have facilitated on their own, thanks to like ABCC and Standing Trees and others who hosted their own meetings and have already kind of done that. And then there's ones where we've been invited and participated, and Isaac and Bill Delasola and I from VHCB. We've gone around to a number of places in the last week, and we will next week. We're doing this almost every day, getting out to be part of a listening session. And it's a little bit hard not to feel like a pledge drive host when you say the same thing over and over again. And but we're trying to really novate each time we come into a space with people, because I think the number one thing that we've realized is that we're talking about land, and people's connection to land starts in their heart. And there are big feelings, no matter if you're trying to help people or if you're changing things, or if people perceive that there's risks. There's a lot of big feelings in this work, and it's been really nice to get out to see people in person, because that helps to put faces to names and more understanding to what we're doing. Welcome, Chris. Chris Campany, everybody, who we did a quick round of intros, but you want to say hi?
Hi, Chris Campany, Wyndham Regional Commission.
Thank you for coming up today.
Sure.
Anyway, so let's see, the other thing we're working on right now, so we're anticipating the April meeting with you all where we'd like to both show you like a sort of summary, begin to show you a summary of what we're hearing and collecting and developing on the themes and priorities that we talked about today. But also to put that in the context of a fully fleshed out table of contents for this framework. Remember, the framework is like the core of the plan, but there will be other sections in a longer document that provide context, executive summary, sort of an implementation section. So in April, that's going to be the focus. That's what we've been working on with Becca and Gunnar. They're working at VHCB and then connecting with A&R and kind of reviewing back and forth to make sure we bring you stuff that we're really connecting back to the feedback we're hearing. So that's what's coming up next in terms of the timetable. So any questions about sort of where we are and what the major inputs? As Annie said, there's 3 more TAC meetings. I expect that some TAC members may want to have scheduled time for other kinds of connections. And so we do welcome that too, especially, and also grantees who have done listening sessions. We've been saying, if you want to schedule some time to debrief afterwards, that's something that we're happy to do as part of this is to, again, like we're going to talk about at lunchtime, how do we continue this, not see it as like a one and done. We're trying to write stuff into a plan and put it on the shelf, but move from ideas to action.
Thank you. I just wanted to add something very quickly,
Yes.
actually, in relation to the stakeholder-led listening sessions.
Yep.
As you said, I think about half of them have been held, and there's planning for the rest that's happening. Over the past few weeks, we have been working with Center for Whole Communities, who are providing additional support to groups who have received an award for those listening sessions, but might need some additional support to put those on. So awardees received an email earlier this week from Stacey Spula, a colleague at VHCB, about how to kind of contact CWC for those kind of supports. And in that same communication, I think Stacey identified that our colleagues at LAOB are also great thought partners for structuring and planning community engagement, and have been really great thought partners as we at VHCB have been thinking about how to engage communities. So just wanted to make sure folks know that resource is out there. If you didn't receive that communication and want more support, please let us know. And thank you to both CWC and LAOB for partnership in that effort and beyond.
Thank you, Andy. I was going to say that the idea that regional listening sessions or the stakeholder-led listening sessions have been, I don't know if they're successful or not successful, if that's even the right construct, but they have given an opportunity for a lot of people to engage and better understand and to begin conversations that will keep going. And that did come as a brainchild of VHCB's partnership with LAOB and Center for Whole Communities. And so we weren't sure how to do this part of this spring. And so far it's been really sort of a happy event to be able to do these and really helpful to us.
I see that Jean has hand up on Zoom.
Thanks, guys. Yeah, I'm curious if folks in the room have been attending any of these community-led sessions. I've gotten to go to a couple and actually help facilitate a couple, which have been really interesting, and excited to connect with some of the others that you all are planning. But I'm curious if you all have been to any, and I don't think there's time on the agenda to talk about them today, right? Or maybe like in the themes.
Actually, that's exactly where I was going to go, was to ask people who's attended and what they're hearing. So,
awesome.
And I'll say that, so it's sort of jumping from Roman numeral 2 to Roman numeral 3. What we put together this week and late last week, again, is a sort of a draft summary of how to begin to categorize or describe in themes what we're hearing, as well as describing some of the context of our work. So that we sent out the other night. That's the 2-pager that says draft all over it. So for us, those themes reflect kind of between VHCB and A&R a way to sort of like organize what we're hearing. But what we wanted to take at least the next 25 minutes to do is hear from TAC members, like if you've been like Gene attending a couple of these, and I see people who have been part of these conversations. Like, what have you been hearing and what's jumping out? And so I think that's where we want to start today. The reason why this is important is because as I was describing that longer table of contents, what we're thinking about trying to do is to organize in themes. So sort of the big ideas and next steps and actions that kind of come, what are we going to do right out of the gates? Like, how do we prioritize when our plan, like that framework, reflects a lot of things that we think are priorities? We didn't put actions into the plan that we don't think are important. So as we lift them up, it's sort of like, okay, well, we know we can move forward right away on things that are urgent, where there's funding and existing programs and where partners are ready to go. And then we know we're going to have to ask the legislature for like more authority or capacity or funding to do some new programs and innovations. But that's a hard concept to communicate to everybody. So we've been hearing, like, how can we make this simpler? So these themes are at the beginning of that, but we're not wedded to the language or the organization that we have. So let's start there today. And then after our break and after some public comment, we're actually going to kind of dig deeper, give some time for people to do some writing and reflecting, and then sort of think like, how would you help us to edit and evolve this document and this set of concepts? So this is both before the break conversation to get stuff out on the table, and then after the break. And I can write stuff down on sticky posts too. I was thinking that if people want to just kind of go around and say, hey, here's what we're hearing, that might be a way that we could get some stuff up on the board here.
Yeah. And back to Jean's question, I think this is an opportunity for TAC and others to share out what are you hearing around the state, and if you're have attended or helped host one of these stakeholder listening sessions, like, what have you heard? How has that been going? I think this is an opportunity for all of that kind of conversation.
And maybe unless somebody's raring and ready to go, I'll just run through quickly what we've been sort of hearing. People really want to focus on like the quality of our work, the impact of our work, the way that we work together, doing things where there's good stewardship, good management, where we're able to pay for the costs of conservation, both now and in the future. So our first theme was quality over quantity. We've heard a lot of suggestions about how to improve our processes and guidelines and policies to make it more accessible. So that's that efficiency prong. There are a lot of, a theme has been all along the inventory of who's part of the conservation community and how do we help people to see themselves in this work, no matter what angle they're coming from. And so closing those gaps and with funding, with capacity, and with representation. A lot of Vermonters have said, and we hear this both from people directly, but also from groups, smaller orgs and communities, is like, it's hard to work with people who have 125 acres, but we hear a lot from people who would like to have some strategy for protecting smaller parcels that don't maybe necessarily rise to the statewide level of, this isn't a big parcel A&R wants to acquire, or the Vermont Land Trust or Nature Conservancy. Those statewide orgs sometimes look and say that doesn't really fit into our program. How do we help those without making stewardship harder? Like we don't want to increase complexity by trying to do more. Enhancing land access and affordability across the working forests, working farms, community recreation spots. Like it's getting harder and more expensive to do this work, which makes it harder both for the kinds of access that require a parking lot or a trailhead, and the kinds of access that are like, if I'm a new farmer, how do I get onto land? If I'm a new landowner, how do I learn how to take care of my family's woodlot? And then viability, stewardship, et cetera, so that we can get people outside, and especially there's the viability of outdoor recreation is one that we've heard a lot about from folks who are engaged in conservation that drives and allows that. So that's a start, right? What else are people hearing?
The clarifying question, Trey. So if I'm to understand this correctly, these are the themes that you have condensed from all of the public comment that you've been receiving through the regional listening sessions, the state.
Yep. Yeah, as we've been listening, we've been trying to think how do we organize this in a.
This is from like the organization that you and VHCP have come up with, and
in collaboration with Becca and folks at ANR as well. But this is again meant to be a starting point, not a finished document.
So, you want to go first?
Sure. And then to you, Chris. I mean, I think a theme that I'm hearing in the community engagement sessions is about relationships. And the challenge posed when conservation is primarily led by large statewide or bigger conservation organizations who are really good at what they do. And also have a set of constraints that guide the way that they do that work and where they do that work and things like that. And so I'm definitely hearing a bunch of community members and organizations that the folks on the ground who have relationships with landowners, who have relationships with farmers, who have maybe more flexibility in how they think about conservation, who participates in conversation, are a really key link in the goals of this plan. And so doing what we can to, I think, enhance the ability of folks on the ground in communities, whether that's conservation commissions or, gosh, we got a lot of shout outs for Cold Hollow to Canada, or rural Vermont, or these other folks that are like really in deep relationship with individual landowners and with community planning processes is a really, really critical piece.
Thank you. And that's a perfect example of what we were hoping for, Emily. Thank you for modeling. What else are people hearing that you want to add to the list? Even if it's kind of addressed here, but you don't like the way it's addressed.
So Wyndham Regional Commission hosted one. I guess we had probably about 40, 45 people attend. What would you guess a lot of people were there thinking they were going to talk about?
Act 250.
What specifically?
Tier 3.
You got it. So after we,
You're so persistent.
I mean, I thought I was going to have to offer a prize to get really people. I have like a pack of peanut butter crackers out in the truck. I was going to offer that as a prize. Okay, all right, good. So after I explained that is not at all what we're going to be talking about. This is a completely different act and has nothing to do whatsoever with Act 181. We got into it. I was not able to stay for the whole conversation, but we kind of did a report out during a staff meeting on Tuesday, and I think there's I think there's still there's this tension between like what is permanently protected versus what's protected, what's conserved, what's conservation, what's access. A lot of kind of questions around, you know, what is, what could be, what should be the role of current use. And I'm trying, there was one other thing. There was also I think kind of like our region is kind of it may seem counterintuitive, but we're still one of the more heavily forested regions of the entire state in the southeast corner of the state. And so I think there's just kind of among some people, a lot of these people are conservation commission focused, kind of like, where are we trying to go with this? Because we're still looking pretty forested and, you know, down here. Not this is just about forest, right? I mean, just like, but literally you look at it seems like there's a lot of conserved land already, just like as you just look out at the landscape. So there was that. I think there's that kind of dynamic too. And maybe this is for later. I'll stop there. Yeah, I myself had a question in your summary, Trey, about enhanced land access. Well, just access comes up a few times. And I just have a couple of questions around that, but I can talk about that later.
Access, you know, it does. I'm just gonna put it down. It's so hard. Alex, go ahead. But if anybody's online after Alex who wants to jump in, make sure you're putting your hand up, and Gunnar and Annie are monitoring.
So we haven't done our stakeholder-led session yet, but Bill and I did a talk up at Lincoln, for their Conservation Commission lecture series the other day. So it was kind of like a mini version of that, effectively. And one, like there was sort of two major themes that came out of our feedback from that, one being very predictable and one not. I did not anticipate the Act 181 element. And people came hot to try about 181. And I think in one hand, we could say like they aren't the same thing, and they're not, and we're not there to speak for, you know, on 181 really. But ultimately, I think there was a fair bit of like concern that we're gonna have to overcome that is out there about like the restriction of people's property rights, yeah, as it pertains to both of these projects that we've got to overcome somehow. So the 181 thing was that caught me a little bit by surprise, but it's out there. There's confusion and there's sort of conflation of the two things, and we've got to figure out a way to deal with that. Thing number two that was much more predictable was simply like I got a lot of text from people afterwards, just with the general theme of I'm in, I love it. What do I do? Which is a harder question to answer than probably should be at this stage. Basically, my response to that has been, you've got, no matter where you are in Vermont, you have like local players in this game around you, and like in the Middlebury Area Land Trust is they've got projects in town. They're a regional entity that's like in this world, and to like engage with them and be part of that process and go to the meetings when there's management plan creation, so that when that process is playing out and so on. But I think that was sort of, that felt to some people like a somewhat insufficient answer. And I think like figuring out how to better direct people towards the real tangible actions they can take when they come away from these things excited about the project is sort of another next thing we gotta kind of dial in a little bit.
And I think that's not put a flag in any of those, but at lunchtime today, we want to talk about how to maintain momentum and not have a plan that sits on the shelf, but that allows people to see a pathway to action. Certainly a conversation has been happening around those local conservation commissions. And then in a lot of places where we've been, it's sort of like, who at the regional level is going to help to organize the work. Like the Wyndham Regional Commission has done a lot of work to create like a conservation collaboration in the Southeast. And then others can kind of tap into that under the auspices of that regional organization. But in other places, like I heard from somebody from Starksboro who said at my town level, the select board doesn't really care about this. And I don't know who do I look to so that Starksboro wants to do this, we can figure out how to move forward.
It seems like the conservation commission angle of it is critical because there is one in every town. They often have conservation reserve funds. They like have the ability to engage with projects. And at least in the terms of, you probably know better than I, but when I was on the Bristol Conservation Commission, nobody in town knew we existed. Like nobody came. We had one guy that came to every meeting. That was the entirety of our non-member attendance for the 3 years I was on it. Getting that, like those groups can be the like local boots on the ground, as it were. Yeah. People got to know about it somehow.
It does seem like local trusts and conservation commissions offer that. There are other local community organizations that might, like community trusts, like Headwaters up in Greensboro, who might be able to be local actors. But then at the regional level, you have planning commissions, there's conservation districts, there's some regionally focused, conservation organizations. So it's sort of like that's something that does keep coming up. And so let's just put that down as like the scaffolding or the multiple scales. And
I just want to build a little bit on the theme of the Act 181 and the other pieces that are coming through. I would say that I'm definitely hearing, I did an ad hoc presentation also at our planning commission meeting last week. I just did it. So you're welcome. I took notes. That what I'm hearing in general is like, it's the layering of Act 250 and Act 181, the stormwater, not stormwater, like the river safety, whatever that one is, 121. It's the school consolidations, district consolidation. It's all of these things, one on top of another, that people are reacting to in whole of local control being lost. And distrust of the folks that they perceive to have a lot of power and a lot of money. And I think whether or not those laws are the same, or like we can spend all day explaining how 181 and 59 are different from each other, but they are layered and the impact is building in people and they're reacting to that loss of control and the impact. And I think that's something that we really have to acknowledge and like talk about directly with people, because that's that's what it's going to feel like in their communities and for individual landowners and for families. And I'm not immune to that as a, you know, as a landowner and as a parent and as a community member myself.
I think at the same time, one of my fears is that because of that, there will be kind of this like big push for hyper local, which I think is great, but we need the resources and the capacity to be able to do that. And I worry about just like shoving off this huge amount of work onto like conservation commissions who are all volunteers and who, you know, some have no budget at all and some have budget. But I think like, how do we balance that between like wanting to give real local control, but also making sure that we're setting people up for success, you know?
Totally appreciate that.
There's a few people on
We have a vibrant chat happening.
Oh, wow.
Thank you to everyone who is participating on the Zoom chat. Maybe we could have a few of those folks share out and then we could keep the discussion.
Yeah, and I wanted to say, let's take about 10 more minutes to get ideas out on the table. Then we can summarize them. And then sort of in the next hour, sort of, okay, so how do we edit the document that we started with today? What would you like to see added to this or changed or et cetera? So,
and maybe even continue, this is a rich conversation we're having.
Yeah, we won't shut it off before it's done. But,
yeah. So there's a number of folks with their hands raised, and then there's some comments who have come through from folks who have asked to share out, but they're not in a place where they can share them right now. So I think we have Nick, Jean, and and Kate Porter all with their hands raised. So I'll encourage.
And then Gannon and Jamie have hands up here. Let's come back to them, and then we'll Jamie, then Gannon, I think was the reviewer. So
great.
take
So
it away.
Nick, you want to kick us off on Zoom?
Sure. Yeah. So really helpful to see the notes come through and building off something that Alice said. We had an outdoor rec listening session last week that was attended by 30 or 40 some folks. And one of the things that session helped crystallize is kind of what we're viewing as a bit of omission in the plan. And it's something that when Alex noted this, like, what can I do or how can we be involved part? And it's the idea, first off, I think folks were really happy to see that the plan talks about how conservation can advance the goals of outdoor recreation as identified and Move Forward Together Vermont. That's a discrete action in the plan. What's missing or feels like it's missing is how can outdoor recreation service the conservation goals in the plan, this kind of loop of how can the interest and the activity and excitement people have around access and outdoor recreation help advance conservation outcomes. And those examples are rich in the past. The Long Trails help conserve 25,000 acres. We have $45 million from the Land and Water Conservation Fund that have come into Vermont over the last 50 years. We have future projects like the Velomont in collaboration with TPL has helped tee up the potential to conserve up to 200,000 acres. That alone would help us tick the box. Not that we're about box ticking. It is about quality over quantity, but that idea of like, there's a lot of energy and enthusiasm, and part of the plan, we know this need for innovation and need to break the paradigm and molds of ways we've operated in the past. So the idea and the really desire for an action or a way to mobilize that community with tools, with some of the resources and harness or leverage, and this will be more specific in our feedback, but that body of active stewards, you know, these to essentially like be able to work and advance conservation projects that help, let's say things like secure access to existing trails that also have important conservation outcomes on the ecological side, the ability to take where we already have relationships with landowners, where we already have a high value recreation asset, and where we can double that on top of ecological outcomes that we really want to see from the plan, the ability to really kind of be more innovative and to potentially kind of leapfrog from the ways we've worked in the past. And just to kind of close, one of the things we touched on across Vermont, 75% of the existing trail infrastructure is on private land, the vast majority of which is unsecured, is just at the whim of a landowner, or we have a written agreement or a handshake. The potential for this plan, I mean, this goes to rec outcomes, but think about how they can dovetail together, potential to leverage this as an initiative to help secure access in ways that also help advance conservation outcomes. So just that idea of, can we make sure the plan has done a lot of setting the table. Can we take this next step to think about where we need to close loops and work, kind of bring things together full circle so we can actually kind of do things differently than we've done in the past, particularly mindful of we're in a resource limited environment. We need to bring everybody to the table.
Thanks, Nick.
Jean, I see you have your hand up.
Thank you. I'm really loving this conversation. Thank you, everyone. Nick, I'm excited about innovation and listening to you talk. We've been wrestling a lot with like, how do we innovate within established systems and established bureaucracies, and like literally, how do we operationalize that? And what does it take to be innovative as a system? I want to link that to a conversation we were in earlier in the week with Chris and the VERDA community. I don't know if any of you all know about the VERDA steering committee, the Rural Technical Assistance group, which is trying to figure out what to do after, now that the report has been written. And this issue of community capacity versus systems capacity is really present in that TA conversation. What was introduced there to me was this concept of capacity building with capacity bringing. And so I'm sorry, I didn't know who in the room was speaking about like, yes, we want to give more community ownership, but we can't just like foist all these decisions and work onto communities that don't have the capacity to do it. And I'm finding this framework of like capacity building, like what kinds of decision making and analysis and tools do we need at the community level? What capacity building do we need to do strategically there versus what do we do in aggregated and shared resources in like a capacity bringing that we support what's happening at the community level. So really just, and then if we combine that with community ownership, that capacity bringing and capacity building is like held centered on a framework of the goal is to empower community ownership over the things that impact their communities the most. It feels like a pretty exciting framework to start building out kind of an operations plan of how do we systemically across land uses, which of course connects directly with municipal capacity and community level capacity. How do we start really bringing these decisions into community ownership, but supported with systemic capacity bringing? So that feels really nerdy and exciting to me. And just quick reflection that the groups that I've been listening with mostly have been agricultural groups. And like this issue of the layering of 181 and even 171, that's like a new one I just learned about. But Jamie, I think at least you are someone in the room, and some of the Woodlands folks probably know what 171 is. And Act 250 and 59, and like these things are completely layered. It's not just a perception of their layering, like they are functioning together. They will function together as policy. That across all of that, the agricultural voice and the working lands voice is really diminished and missing. So like our future land use maps that came out of 181 did no agricultural land analysis or planning. There was no category for agricultural land other than like rural, residential, rural conservation. That is how agricultural land was considered. And the ag community, the NOFA, the Intervale, the Farm to Plate, are kind of spinning out right now about like, oh God, we've been left out of everything. What's going on here? And so like, we are very much working with many of you to take this next step to be like, oh, no. Vermont like needs its culture of agriculture. And we need to double down and really like remind policy-making spaces how central agriculture is to our very special life here. Our very special communities are centered in a thriving culture of agriculture. Thank you very much, everyone. Nice to see you, Hannah. Congratulations on your political ambitions. I'm so excited. We want to get more farmers in the State House. That's a campaign, Hannah. Actually, we'd love to see like in the next, not this session, but next session, at least 10 farmers in that State House, real farmers. Thank you.
Who? What?
I think Hannah must be running.
Oh, okay.
This.
Yep. I am running for state senate for Madison County. So this is a fairly new development. So thank you, Jean.
Thank you, Jean.
Yes, there are no farmers in the state senate, not one. So until next year.
Kate, I see you have your hand up, and then I do have a comment that I'll read out from someone, and then we'll get to Dan and then Jamie. Yeah, that's okay. Perfect. Kate,
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, everybody. And Jean, I appreciate those comments. And just to follow up on that, I have a couple of kind of quick comments, I guess. One is, Jean, like you said, again, following up on this idea of Vermont needs a culture of agriculture. I just kind of want to recenter us in it's not just agricultural, it's forestry as well, right? So we are, a state that is over 80% forested. Our forest economy is such a important part of our landscape. It's part of our culture, and it's part of our values, as a state. And so, I want to share. I mean, I guess I appreciate the conversation today and hearing all the excitement over the plan. I think as I've traveled around the state and had conversations with folks, I have to say I've heard quite a bit of concern around the current iteration of the draft and how it's sort of there's an opportunity really to strengthen how it's centered in the economic reality faced by landowners and woodland owners in particular. As many of you guys are well aware, our forest landowners are managing and caring for their forests under increasing pressures from taxes and market uncertainty and all sorts of other layers, of policy decisions. And so I think in some respects, we're missing an opportunity to really kind of strengthen some of the work around supporting woodland owners and keeping forests through good stewardship and through a viable forest economy. I know there's several areas in the plan that talk about working lands and working forests, but I'd really like to encourage us to spend some time really teasing that out and really kind of building that out, because I think right now, unfortunately, from some within the forestry community, it feels like the plan really doesn't acknowledge that relationship and that need enough. And so, I guess I bring that comment forward to say I think there's a real opportunity for some of this conversation to focus on how do we strengthen that, and how do we bring that perspective and that voice of landowners forward a little bit more. I also, just again, in echoing the conversation around, Act 181, I think, we held our landowner session yesterday, and there was a lot of confusion, a lot of concern around, sort of like it was mentioned, kind of the layering of these different policies, all sort of feeling like they're coming together at the same time. I'd really like to encourage us to think about, like, sort of strategically, how do we, as TAC, and how does this initiative, sort of address that? Because I think that for many landowners, that's a real concern. And frankly, I think something that, it's sort of an opportunity for us to think a little bit about more strategically about how are these initiatives connected, and, what is, the opportunity, both, for statewide, but also, as we're thinking about kind of strategic conservation, how can we sort of how can we weave some of these initiatives together a little bit better and maybe more strategically. And then I guess another, and I don't know that this has come up in other conversations, but one other thing I just wanted to flag in terms of some of my conversations again with private landowners, is a conversation around how, I know the way that the legislation was passed, and the definitions are really focused around conservation as durable and permanent. But many landowners I've talked to have said to me, I already have deed restrictions, or I already hold my land in an LLC. And so I think that there's a real opportunity for us to be thinking about
how.
So yeah, there's some feedback there. I think there's a real opportunity for us to think about some of these other mechanics and ways that landowners are engaging in conservation beyond conservation easements, and try to support some of these other mechanisms that are used in legacy planning and long-term stewardship goals, in order to support sort of this goal of keeping forests forested. And so I put that comment in the chat. And I think for many landowners, again, just to kind of echo some of what I've heard, some of these other mechanisms offer a lot more flexibility, and kind of intergenerational flexibility that I think for landowners is increasingly important. So I'm going to summarize a lot of the feedback that we've been hearing and share it with VHCB and others. But I just wanted to sort of chime in with those thoughts, and again, really, encouraging us to kind of make sure that we're centering the plan and our conversations, really in the reality facing landowners. Because I think that that's feedback that I've heard from throughout the state, that folks just really feel like the current draft and the current conversations are really focused on increasing capacity for organizations, increasing capacity around communities, but like how are we supporting and helping individual landowners? Feels like we have an opportunity to strengthen that. So I'll leave it there. Thank you, everybody.
Beautiful. Thank you, Kate. Annie's going to read one comment from online. That Jamie, Gannon, and Bob had hands up here in the room. We're a little like our schedule today really has a lot of accordion flex in it because it was like all the songs go into the next, like a Grateful Dead concert. So it's really like we can go from one to the next. So we will pause after those unless anybody else has a share. I want to put some public comment on the table as well. There's some people, members of the public online and in the room today. So we'll also, we can add things that they're hearing or other public comments at that time. Then we'll take a quick stretch and then come back and kind of dive into this. But I think it's really good to keep getting this out on the table rather than kind of just blindly following the time schedule. So one online, few in the room, and then we'll see where we are.
Kelly Stetner with Ottaquechee Natural Resource Conservation District also held a stakeholder listening session and just wanted to share. I'm going to summarize, but there was a good bit of detail here. So thank you, Kelly. Mirroring a lot of what we're hearing, questions, concerns, confusion around how this ties to Act 181, property values in general, legacy of land use, questions about, why this push for 30 by 30? Does Vermont really need to be a part of this? We have a lot of small grassroots orgs working hard and successfully at stewardship practices and messaging, partnership with rural Vermonters. We've come far as a state, reforesting since the big sheep boom, and it feels like this push towards easements is a land grab. That's just what she's hearing.
Okay.
Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you, Kelly. Yeah, Jamie, go ahead, and then Gannon and Bob.
Yeah, thanks. Really appreciating this conversation. I think it's naming a lot in an appropriate way, a lot of the tensions that are out there, and we need to be mindful of that. And the tension between housing and conservation is something that we've been grappling, and I think trying to have a narrative in Vermont that we can do this in a way that doesn't need to be at odds. Yet there's always the devil in the detail. We're dealing with a lot of pressures and challenges right now, from climate and flooding to biodiversity decline. So crisis. There's a lot coming together here, and I think that the fact that there's two Act 59 and Act 181 come together, they're both sort of very forward-looking initiatives to try and address these crises. And so, in my mind, I've always kind of thought of Act 59 as sort of like the incentive side of it. Like, how are we helping landowners, willing landowners who want to do conservation? But there's so much more embedded in it, and the Act 181 is more the land use side of it. So there's always going to be tension as we try to balance out where we're deregulating, which is part of Act 181, and where there are some improvements on the conservation side. One ties together though, just as far as some of the themes. I think that there's a need to have both Act 59 and Act 181 seen as bottom-up approaches. So I like the fact that we're identifying themes and identifying areas that are going to need to continue and work. We're not trying to, we need to, I think, have some clear and ambitious ideas in the plan, and need to continue some of the narrative. So I would just like to put that on the table and I know you've got that teed up. And I think we need to somehow in our messaging help the public understand about on Act 181 side right now, there's legislation, S325, which will create more breathing room, push the deadlines out for years so that stakeholders in there can be more bottom-up conversation and understand the concerns, try and address and find the right balance points. So that's part of the effort. And
those were timetables for Act 181 or for both?
Well, for 181, we would really be pushing out, extending interim exemptions, for where areas will not have Act 250 coverage. And I think that, it's getting lost in the conversation right now that's a lot of what Act 181 is doing, which is actually deregulating. And then there are conservation elements where there are concerns, and the planning for those elements are going to be pushed out until at least 2 more years. If not, the Senate version would actually have the implementation of the new road rule pushed out to 2030. So things are getting extended. And I just want to come back quickly to a theme that's come up here because it's beyond the listening sessions. You know, in the legislature, there was just debate with H70 as to whether current use should be included in the goals, whether permanent conservation should be stripped from the bill. And so that's a big issue, and I think we need to tackle that. We need to talk about it. And to Kate's point, I think that there's a suite of strategies we need to lift up in this plan. There's meeting the conservation vision. Kind of what's the suite of permanent, durable, intermediate strategies that all come together? How do we recognize them as being important? And I just want to throw this out there because I feel like it's missing in the themes, and that's there's a lot of support for more wildlands conservation in Vermont, and there's a lot of support for working lands. And my impression is the majority of people I talk to believe in both, and it's a question of how. And I feel like as part of this Act 59 conversation, so far we've missed the opportunity to kind of look at where are the opportunities to lift both up in this plan in a way that where we can find some common ground versus allowing those almost to divide us, as if the H70 conversation feels embedded in as a threat that working lands is not being recognized in this plan, when the reality is I think a lot of us want to see the plan succeed for working lands. The majority of conserved land in Vermont achieves working lands conservation, should be recognizing the utility of the current use plan. And we should be acknowledging that we do have room for improvement on wildlands. Let's find a way to have a conversation on that doesn't divide us, but that can find ways to move forward in advancing the values of both.
Yeah, thank you. We'll editorialize because you have the whole rest of the morning. Ian, will you? Sure. And then Bob, and then we'll see if anybody else has got something to throw out there.
Thanks everybody for what you shared. I really appreciate it all and hearing everybody else's experiences in these listening sessions. And I mean, maybe build on some of that and what Jamie just said. I think, yeah, the point of we're still arguing about the what instead of the how is resonating with me, and also kind of leads into what I was thinking as well. And what I noticed at the listening sessions, and what I think I heard from some of the other folks, Kelly, Alex, Chris, is that people are still not fully understanding what this act is and isn't. And I think we're a bit to blame for that, and that like they don't understand how Act 250 fits in, where UBA fits in, what counts, what doesn't, how they can help, how they can contribute. And as I said, I think we could do a better job in communicating exactly what this is and what this isn't. And earlier on in the TAC process, we had talked about clearly establishing sideboards and helping draft that narrative, and so that folks understand how they can best engage in this act. And I don't know if we really came to a clear answer on that conversation. And I think in trying to be everything to everyone in this act, maybe we've lost a bit of like the unique niche that this act can serve for everyday Vermonters, and how this act can really help protect our lands, our values, help us reach our goals. So I think if to work on creating a clear narrative and a cleaner conversation about what this act is and isn't would just help us in that regard. What else? And then another note I had, and I think that'll also help us implement it too. If we keep this to a clear understanding, it'll just help with implementation and help landowners, organizations, and community to carry this forward. And then one note that Jamie brought up that I also noted is I don't see the ecological protections and biodiversity referenced in these themes, and maybe that's not what you're hearing, but I know, like Trey, from our table that we sat at last week down in Randolph, we were talking about old forest and the protection of rare species. We were talking specifically about UVA and whether it counts and whether it doesn't. So what I hear when I talk to landowners and to communities, and it may be within the TNC echo chamber, but is their interest really starts with like what is on their land, the ecological features, the species walking through their backyard, the forest that they want to see kept intact. And I think some of that is, or at least I'm not seeing that represented in these themes at the moment.
Good. Let's talk about how to, we didn't intend to leave that out, but let's talk about how to make it more clear. And then Bob Zeno.
Sure. I think Jamie and Gannon hit upon a lot of the things that were in my mind, hearing all this discussion and kind of synthesizing it. And I think maybe building or echoing that, thinking about what this plan can do that it's really well situated to solve and advance. And I think, like, for biodiversity, the Act 59 is not about solving the biodiversity crisis single-handedly with one tool. It's about how can permanent land conservation contribute to that? And I think that carries over to other things too. Like, how can permanent land conservation advance working lands? How can it advance agricultural lands? Not solve every issue related to all of these things, but how can we focus, starting with permanent land conservation, and really emphasize willing landowners, which I think is what's different from this than Act 181, and then go from there. How can willing landowners contribute to these different ways, and how can we make that better, more efficient, easier, better funded, on and on? That seems like where we really have the power to get stuff done here.
Chris?
I asked our staff person, Margot, who led the session, what did she take away? So I just want to share that from, so it was that if we want municipal entities to be a conservation partner, there should be guidance on what different entities could do to support land conservation. What could conservation commissions be doing, select boards, et cetera. Also, the plan needs to be accessible, or at least the parts that are actions and summaries. There's too much jargon. Because we asked people to kind of prioritize, like, among the different actions, like what their preferred priorities were. And so everybody read them. But right, if you, and it's true. I mean, if you read the actions, it reads like I'm not saying this harshly because I'm part of this ecosystem too, but right, it reads like a policy document. It doesn't read like a guidebook for, especially if you're a landowner or something, right? And I understand that, and that's always there's always that tension there. I just want to say so sitting wearing my RPC hat for a second, where all this stuff is coming together. Honest to God, Tier 3 and the road rule are just sucking all the energy out of the room. In all of our meetings with our towns about, we're meeting with towns in our, because we're in our, as part of we're doing our future land use maps per Act 181, and this is relevant to all this. I'm not just trying to go off, but I think it's important for everybody to understand. When we're meeting with towns about, the main thing we really need to engage with them on is Tier 1A and Tier 1B, right? The growth areas and the centers and stuff. And especially for our region, just so folk know, right? One of the things that Act 181 did was standardize all the different future land use areas. So that way all the maps could be stitched together and you kind of have, from the bottom up, a statewide land use map. But invariably, we're not talking about town plans and, Tier 1A and Tier 1B areas and where we should be directing growth and like, hey, town, if you want to be Tier 1B, how do you get to that? And it's all about it's that conversation is why it ends up being about 5 minutes, because we're answering all the damn questions about the stuff that's not in our wheelhouse, which is the LURB Tier 3 and road rule, which is about applying for a permit. So I think part of the language around Tier 3 and the road rule about conservation, nothing there says you can't build anything. It says you have to apply for a permit. And so I've actually reached out to, and if I seem kind of amped up about this, it's like we're getting really tired of talking about this. because we're not able to talk about the land use planning. We're having to talk about these small areas in the state for which you're going to have to apply for an Act 250 permit for where maybe you didn't before. And it probably would have done us all a lot of good to kind of get out in front of this and say, and this is what applying for an Act 250 permit means. This is what's involved with an administrative permit. These are the other permits. This is how long they usually take. This is what's involved. Because what's been conflated is applying for an Act 250 permit means you cannot use your land.
That's what sort of the bugaboo.
Right.
Act 250 is it is a term that has taken on a culturally loaded,
yeah,
connotations.
Yeah. And
so we are also just, I mean, to be clear, I think a lot of people here tonight, today, where are we? Have been hearing this in their listening sessions too, and certainly VHCB is getting both email and feedback that's conflating the things. I think the point that from a rural landowner perspective, these things are like a set of layers that all come together in a lasagna that they don't want to eat. It's not helping people understand it. And I was talking to somebody from outdoor rec groups yesterday who called up. I thought he was calling to ask how can outdoor recreation really navigate through this Act 181 process to think about how to do more of the work. And he was saying, no, I'm calling because I'm really frustrated. Like, am I not going to be able to build a sugar house?
Exactly.
And I said, I don't think that's where this is headed. First of all, and second of all, let's try to help people understand. And so anyway, we were talking, I said, well, we did the Shoreland Protection Act in 2013 and 2014. It did take away a set of landowners' rights from the perspective of shoreland property owners. And what Senator Mazza, the late Senator Mazza said while we were working on that bill is I get this, my district has all this shoreland miles, I support this, but I'm not going to support it until you take a whole summer to go out and explain to people how it works.
Yes.
And I will support your bill.
Yeah, and now we're chasing that. We're like running behind it.
I think that's something that got missed, and that's why our lunchtime conversation today is about how do we not do that with this, put a plan on the shelf and then expect it's going to take off and people understand, but create through lines for the regional groups, the local groups, the statewide groups, for A&R in those groups, for the big land trusts in those groups. Because we were able to go and take newspaper reporters with us, demonstrate how the law would work, what you could do, have town meetings, watershed groups, et cetera. So by the end of it, some people were still property rights and like, I don't want this, but it passed overwhelmingly.
And I'll just say,
So how do we recreate that environment?
Because this is a public meeting, I just want to say our frustration, like I'm saying, but this is with me and among my staff. It's not with the people who have concerns. It's with it's that we're now having to chase everything and the really good, strong, important conversations we should be having, we can't have because the groundwork wasn't laid. And it's not angering anybody. I'm not accusing anybody of anything. It's just in hindsight, because I'm also working on the river corridor stuff and the flood hazard bylaw review stuff, right? And then in my world too, I'm looking at because now I think we're already seeing the flood amnesia, and there's the concerns about I can't do stuff in my river corridor anymore. It's like, how much stuff do you want to do in your river corridor? Because guess what? There's no public money to bail you out if whatever you've got in your river corridor washes away.
Yes.
So I feel like we're kind of losing the plot because we didn't kind of lay the groundwork about how this stuff stitches together. Anyway, I'll hush up, but that's just kind of the reality in the ground out there around because we're kind of at the RPC level, we're kind of like where all this stuff is kind of coming together, and it's almost like, I don't know, trying to think of a good metaphor, but it's kind of like, it's like a low and slow landslide kind of coming at us. And we're just kind of, we're pushing a stone over here, we're pushing a stone over here, we're pushing a stone over there. Meanwhile, we're not really getting a lot of really good planning done because we're having to kind of push on all the other stuff.
That's some heavy stuff, everybody. Chris, thank you for being articulate.
Yeah, sorry if I don't know how.
No. I think we all have the sense that any of these things were very well intentioned. They were thought through. And it's easy for things to get lost in translation. So we're going to recognize that. I want to see if there's anybody online with any additional thoughts.
So Hannah does have her hand up.
Okay,
But I know we are kind of
well, it's,
blowing past our agenda.
that's so, I think
Yeah.
the two things were meant to flow into each other.
Okay, great. Hannah?
I'll be super quick. So along with our 30 by 30 goal, there's another 30 by 30 goal, which is to grow 30% of the food in New England that's consumed in New England. So the more we can mention that, probably the better. And then I really liked somebody's point about presenting this project, like how can we help advance other goals, such as the 30 by 30 food produced? How can we work together, and what are we up against? And I think the floods is a great example. That was a very clear image of what we're up against, and we can be united against that. The other thing we're up against is a sneaky silent thing, which is private equity and billionaires buying up farmlands at astonishing rates. I know in our small business, we get offers every single week by private equity, giving us cash, that's happening everywhere. So in my mind, I'm motivated by this project. Yes, it has its problems and we need to work out our differences here, but who we're up against is private equity and massive amounts of money that is buying up farmland across the United States. And I would trust the state of Vermont a lot more than I would trust private equity. That's all.
Thank you, Hannah. That's really helpful. I want to have, if there's any members of the public online who have a comment that they'd like to share or in the room, we want to take about 10 minutes for that, if that's sufficient, and then take a little break and come back and pick this up. And when we come back, we'll pick it up. And I have one thought to share before we go to break, but I want to hear from members of the public first.
Yeah, so this is the public comment opportunity number 1 on the agenda. So if any folks on Zoom who are members of the public want to speak, you can raise your hand or just come up. Not seeing anyone yet.
We do have one member of the public here in the room. Zach is here, and Zach, if you want to come up and with a microphone, can catch you. Happy to hear a comment.
Checking from online, but
yeah, they're saying that.
I'm not seeing anyone.
Well, thanks everyone. Good to see you all. Zach Porter, Executive Director of Standing Trees, live here in Montpelier. Yeah, grateful for the chance to weigh in. I wanted to give an update on the listening session that we just hosted and just reflect on some of the conversation this morning. First of all, I want to thank Jamie, Hannon, and Bob for their excellent comments just now. Really, really appreciate what they all just shared. And, we are really good in New England at working lands, to use that term, which is, I think, a complicated term, but just to use it, working lands conservation. I think all lands work for us, is why I say that. But working lands conservation, we excel at it. We are almost to 30%. We have 27% of Vermont and about the same amount of New England already conserved, thanks to the great work of our land trust community, state and federal government. There's so much more to do in the working land space. And then there's also so much to do in the wildland space. And there is room for all of it, as I think was just mentioned. I think you're all familiar with the numerous reports that have come out in the last several years, pointing that out, right? That we could protect 20% of the New England landscape as wildlands and still produce all of our wood products locally. That's the Beyond the Illusion of Preservation report that came out just last year. None of these things are in conflict with each other. And so I think the framing is so key, as has been, I think, identified already in this conversation. And I too worry that we are pitting things against each other for reasons I can't understand, because we have so much evidence available that shows that we can do it all. you know, there have been comments just now about how perhaps certain groups have felt like they haven't had a full seat at the table. And I just want to say again, I think I probably said this before, that one of the groups that this legislation sought to put at the table is the group that literally has no voice. It's the ecosystems and the species that we share this land with that don't get to vote, that don't get to have representation in the state house, alongside, of course, all of these other really important needs that our communities have. And of course, recognizing that those ecosystems, those species, their presence supports all of us, makes our lives possible, makes our work possible, makes our communities livable. One thing that was just coming to me as you were talking, I think Chris Campany said that the document right now is a little bit, I don't know, I'm not trying to say this critically either, but dry perhaps, right? And I was thinking, what's one thing that we could do to enliven the document? And last night at our listening session, where we had fantastic turnout, I was corrected, I think we had 60 people there, about 18 online, and then easily around 40 people in person, maybe a little bit more, at Millbrae College. And, you know, I think people are looking for the document to speak to them maybe a little more directly. And there could be a section in the document that's, here are things you can do as a private landowner. Here are the things that public agencies can do for next steps. Kind of distilling even from the long list that comes later, even if you end up keeping all that other content, there could be, you know, a handy guide at the beginning of the document that is a kind of interpretive tool for identifying where there are things that later on in that report that really speak to that particular person. Here's what you can do. Here's how you can contribute. I think Alex maybe was speaking to this too. I can't remember exactly, but good questions, and I think good opportunities there. And, you know, I think just lastly to say that, again, maybe this is, you know, well, when you hold stakeholder meetings, right, inevitably you're getting a slice of the public that is probably a little more geared to the entity that's bringing people together, right? So, you know, to Gannon's point, there's probably a little bit of that echo chamber effect. But I want to assure you all that there are many Vermonters who care about wild things and wild places, and they absolutely want to make sure that you know, that's reflected in the final document, and are worried that perhaps, you know, we're running out of time to make sure that there is an even greater kind of scientific basis for what's going into this. And maybe also I'll make a suggestion that at the outset of this document, there could be more of a review of what do we know about the way that Vermont is changing right now? What do we know about how the ways that we manage our land and relate to our land, how does that either help us overcome these crises that we're facing or actually put us in a worse spot than we are right now? How do those choices that we make matter? And what choices can we make differently in the future, that, you know, from managing our floodplains differently, to removing dams, to restoring wetlands, to protecting our headwaters? Those are the kinds of things that I think, you know, could be called out for perhaps more of an analysis of what's the best available science. Because remember, the Vermont Conservation Design is great, but it came out almost 10 years ago. And so, and Vermont Conservation Design doesn't attempt to cover everything exhaustively. There's, in the legislation, it's clear that it's VCD and the other scientific literature. And so how are we weaving all of that in? Anyways, thank you for the chance to.
I ran out of space to put the other scientific literature in, but heard, and thank you. I tried to capture everybody's comments. So we're going to take 10 minutes now until 11. We'll come back. We have about 15 minutes then. We'll do a little, as we get started, I'll repeat. We have people to look at what we put out here now. Look at how we started to do this, and let's talk about how that, at least for feedback to us, how can we begin to edit this and turn that document into the basis for some of the things that you just talked about going into the plan. So how does that become part of a snappier executive summary? You know, first of all, is it a good idea to organize around themes? We already have objectives. So is this additive to try and distill this into kind of plainer language concepts? And then to drive that executive summary, to drive the like actions that we can do. Here's how we're organizing actions we can do right away and we want to get started with. Here's how we're organizing the recommendations for where we need more funding and capacity. And how we also, we want to make sure that even if people provide comments that don't end up being a specific action in the plan, but the legislature sees what we've heard in total. That under each objective, we provide a summary of how people have reacted to the pathways and actions in there. And again, using, I think, some version of a plain language themes concept to organize what we've heard. What do people think about, if supposing you all liked the concept of quality over quantity, what are we hearing about that? Is that supported? Do people have questions about that? Who has questions and what are they? So that's a lot of what we want, is to help the legislature have a record, even though we can be very specific. The other thing I'd ask people to grapple with a little bit, and it's implicit in the agenda today, but people brought up scope. I think Jamie and Gannon and Bob's comments were all about kind of the scope of where this plan stops and where other plans start. And I think we'd be honest with you and say, that's something we'd kind of still like your help with, because we feel like the mandate and the act did ask us to consider viability, enterprise, the types of things that are in those other plans, but we don't want to just repeat the Forest Future Action Plan. That's already there. So is the food security roadmap. So is the Move Forward Together document. So are there specific things in those that we want to lift up? How do we lift up those other initiatives and keep this grounded in permanent conservation, long-term conservation, stewardship, management, access? Those are kind of the core concepts that are threaded throughout. So, but I don't think we were asked to only make a plan for permanent conservation. We were supposed to think about the through line to stewardship and viability as well, but we don't want to have competing recommendations to those other plans, and we don't necessarily want to just repeat them. So that's just something for people to think about. The RIS, the Climate Action Plan, Resilience and Mitigation Strategy, Climate Action Plan, Forest Future Roadmap, Forest and Wildlife Action Plans, Conservation Design, Move Forward Together Vermont, and Access Opportunity Boards, where there's a lot going on. We want to help that, but not dominate that or confuse that. So that's kind of the conceit of objective 2, but maybe we need to spend a little bit of time thinking about where the like dotted line is and where the solid line is and what's in and out. Anyway, let's come back at 11 and jump back in.
By password. Already used you guys for my therapy session.
Let's see.
No worries in that.
I just, turns out I'm maybe using it.
What capacity?
Market.
Do you know what
Annie,
the
what's
Thompson
the
is?
Wi-Fi is Blueberry?
You actually went to college together.
Blueberry 46.
Then, okay.
Not
His dad's a friend.
Okay. Okay. Blueberry 42. All right. Interesting.
Oh, I'm there. I'm there.
Oh, right.
My wife finished.
Oh.
She's.
No, my son's. Senator Danny Luce just reached out to have lunch. How fun is that?
Yeah, he was somewhere.
Yeah. I think,
Someone
know
would
how I
want to be able to like have their dog come in and like
Dating bouncer.
shower off
Coming over.
poo.
I have a dark gray, like marry them suit that I can put on.
We're all gonna like that.
Sunglasses that I really bounce.
That's the first time I've ever heard the phrase Marion Barium suit outside my own family. I appreciate that, right?
Yeah,
My dad and I share one.
Yeah.
Wait.
We had a mutual friend die a little while ago, and I got the shirt and he wore the pants and it.
I don't put a suit on that many times anymore, so I said the one. There's a few in the closet that don't. They fit some other version of me that I do.
I've not worn a suit since my first day at the Environmental Protection Agency in 1991.
Oh, that's something record.
Let's get started again, everybody, if we can. Only because having you all together is so precious, and it's already the morning is moving quickly. I think Andy's going to kind of kick us off, and Isaac wanted to just say one thing about the themes before we dive in, but we're going to get going now, and we're going to aim to finish up around 11:50. Do public comment again in case there's new thoughts from anybody online. If there's not, we can lunch will be here. We can grab our lunch, take a second break, do some emails, and whatever you need to do real quickly. And then we have a topic for lunchtime. So, Annie, thank you. Are we off mute again? And
We are off mute. Can you hear us? Hannah, thumbs up. Beautiful. Okay. So we are now going to return to that draft kind of themes document that was shared out with the TAC in the email Trey found out earlier this week, and we do have copies here in the room if anyone needs one. But again, this document is really VHB and A&R's kind of collective initial attempt to pull together what we've heard throughout this most recent round of engagement and listening, but honestly, what we've heard throughout the duration of this project, and try to start organizing the feedback and general kind of topics that we're hearing into some high-level themes that we can use to organize ourselves as we again think about what does implementing this plan look like? How does that show up in the draft plan? What is that kind of next step? We have that expanded framework, objectives, pathways, actions. How do we organize this in a way that it really is useful as we talk about implementing the plan? So we are going to give the TAC just 5 minutes to kind of sit with this document for those who haven't had a chance to really review it yet. And we have a set of discussion questions that we'll also put up on a slide. And that's really how we want to frame up this next conversation, some discussion questions that we have. But I think that we're also kind of open to hearing general, which is one of the questions, but general feedback on these themes and buckets, and just have this really great conversation about what TAC members are hearing. So what's missing from these themes? What that's really what we want to talk about with this last kind of big discussion section today. And I think, Isaac, you were going to give just one example of how to think about these themes and how they relate to some of the draft actions.
Yeah, based on our earlier conversation, I thought it might be helpful to illustrate like quality over quantity and sort of some of our thinking that underlies that theme. I think we are thinking about this as a way of organizing the plan and the actions themselves. And so a couple of examples of sort of things that are already in the plan that we feel like is pointing to quality, not quantity. The obvious one is implementing Vermont conservation design and those priority areas that might be more expensive to target because they're in more developed or more easily developable areas. We might want to focus our conservation dollars there. So it's like the implementing Vermont conservation design falls under quality, under not quantity. Stewardship costs and fully funding the cost of conservation is about quality, not quantity, quality over quantity. And then for agriculture, we're hearing a ton of feedback around access and the desire to think about innovative ways of facilitating affordable access to farmland conservation. And that means an additional per acre investment, but comes with an increased return on investment. And so we're sort of seeing these as broad buckets under which a lot of the plan's actions are falling. And I think the question is whether we've captured sort of all, whether there are gaps or whether there are themes as some, so I did hear some earlier that might be missing.
Yeah.
And so just talking about the breadth of that first one, just as a way of thinking about how we're thinking about the themes.
So let's take, yeah, so if people want to take the rest of 5 minutes until about 10 or 11 after, just to, if you want to jot down some notes or questions or comments in the doc.
Well, just a clarifying question to make sure I understood. Were you saying that these themes would replace the sort of 3 bucket, or is this, no?
Well,
I didn't hear.
we were thinking about a narrative-based approach because of we've been hearing the feedback a lot that this framework is hard to get into. So in the executive summary of the plan, in the implementation section of the plan, what are we getting ready to do? What do we need more resources to do? We were trying to think of a way to be topical in the way that we organize those actions and priorities. And so a discussion question we have, I think you can flip to that slide while people are thinking, is does that make sense? Or is it more confusing to introduce new concepts now when we've already got 3 objectives? We could just organize kind of next steps under each objective, but we've been hearing that people want something that's broken out, that's more thematic and narrative. So that's what this is. It's a first draft. I would also point out that the top section, there's a set of assumptive, presumptive statements there that are still in draft form too. And before we start making those kind of generally, wanted to see how those resonate with people too. So again, Garen.
All right. Just maybe I'm just still not understanding this. Those themes that you're listing are themes from feedback from public comment on the expanded framework, not themes that you are identifying as these are the critical themes that carry forward in the narrative, or are we conflating those two? Am I conflating those two things?
Well, we did write these based on what we've been hearing. So we were trying to bucket and broadly capture, sets of actions and how people feel about them. Like one of the things that we haven't really heard too many places people say, we think you should just race to conserve any old acre you can as fast as possible. Mm-hmm. Instead, we've really been hearing people say, we need more TA, we need more support. We need to focus more on the priority areas of conservation design. We need more supports for people, new farmers. We need more supports for, the Forest Future Roadmap infrastructure that will help keep the forest a forest. So all those things are quality investments that go across from planning to acquisition of conservation interests, to stewardship and management, to the long-term viability of the enterprises and sectors that interact with conserved lands. People are asking for quality, not quantity. So I think that's what we feel pretty good about. The others there's some muddiness in them, and we again trying to create sort of a broad way to talk to people. This wasn't necessarily at the session on Monday, somebody said, I think you should do quality over quantity. That's more VHCB, and then we consulted with A&R and said,
yeah. I guess my point being themes that you're distilling from public on the framework that you put forward feels very different than the themes that we should put forward for the plan itself.
Yeah.
And I'd like to merge those two things though.
Yeah, no, I think we are thinking about it as a potential pathway for organizing the plan's recommendations in a simple way that's understandable. People can understand quality over quantity sort of intuitively, and it's sort of a good framing potentially. And so the question is that a good potential way to frame the recommendations in a simple and understandable way? Is that adding another layer where it's just okay, now there's another thing to think about. There's themes, and there's also all these other ways that we've been categorizing things. And so I think that's an open question.
But if you could imagine, there might be an executive summary that does a discussion of these themes, and then underneath it says, to see the actions that support quality over quantity, here's the list of references to the framework. Here are the actions that really uplift this in objective 1, objective 2, and objective 3, so that people can see the big ideas and then see where they play out in the plan framework itself. And that, again, that may be more confusing, or hope maybe it's a better guide up front for people. So, other quick clarifying questions. Thank you both for those questions. Do people want to take a minute to look over this, to just read through this? And just give a thumbs up. We'll move on as soon as people are ready. People getting there? Dolly? Anybody not quite ready? We'll get going. All right. I can describe again on the switchboard. You want to follow people and facilitate? Sure. Okay.
All right. Folks feeling like they've had an opportunity to review that document? Okay, so we have a number of discussion questions up on this slide, and we can kind of use them to guide this conversation, and also very open to feedback in general, especially if this is still unclear or kind of what does this mean? That is totally appropriate feedback at this point, and happy to hear that and continue discussing that. But I think if we start out with that kind of what are TAC members' initial reactions to this summary document of kind of context setting and then themes. Let's just start there. But any of the questions up here are open for discussion. So initial reactions. Alex.
I think one of my initial reactions, sort of playing off of one of some of the things we've talked about before, is that this does, once again, kind of leaves out the biodiversity and ecological directives of the act. And I think the greater question that leads to is, to what degree are we comfortable like moving past some, purely focusing on the directives given to us by public feedback in these particular meetings versus like the things the act directs us to do that maybe we're not hearing as much of from the public, because the biodiversity, element of it is certainly in the meetings I've been part of, due to the groups that I'm engaging with, they don't come up to the same degree that some of the access related objectives do. At the same time, the act is the act, the law is the law. We're tasked with following that. And so I think somewhere along the line there, we have to like come up with a sense of just how to approach the directives given to us by public feedback versus those given to us by the act, so that we don't leave out these things that aren't going to be advocated for as resoundingly from constituents, because again, as Zach pointed out, a lot of those things relate more to the non-human beneficiaries of what we're trying to do here.
Thanks for that.
Like if that being left out of the consolidation of feedback suggests that we've got to figure out how to approach that particular end of the ball.
Yeah, no, I think that's really helpful feedback, because our intention is definitely not to leave out biodiversity with these themes, and not to move away from the directive of the act. And I think like these themes certainly represent what we've been hearing, but I also think it's just sort of like they represent what we've been hearing throughout this entire process. And so they are intended to be holistic, as the actions are holistic and aligned with the scope of the plan as we've drafted it. So anyways, just to say, I think what I'm definitely hearing is that biodiversity is not coming across strong enough in the themes. But it wasn't sort of an intention to orient to what we're hearing in the public or to narrow or change the scope in some way from what the act directs us to do.
I think Nick's got a hand up on that.
Yes, Nick does have a hand up. Go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, I mean, I've looked over these for a while. One of the things that came to mind, rather than putting another framework in front of folks at the front end, these kind of feel like the cross-cutting, how are we going to accomplish these things? Like they're a set of almost, if we, the actions are very specific, we have the objectives that are VCD communities and the capacity side of things. Feels like it's almost like when we bundle all that up, what are the cross-cutting ways in which we will implement this plan, that like the sort of requisite things to be successful? We're going to have to prioritize, we're going to have to streamline it. Like there are these things that are general, like they're not goals for the plan in and of itself, but they're like, sort of like keys for success. I don't know what they're right, but they do feel like these cross-cutting implementation values that are a little bit different than the front end. I think that as folks spoke about the sort of ecological sort of needing to bring the biodiversity piece up front, like that's why I don't feel like these come on the front end. They're almost are like, okay, we talked about what we want to accomplish. We talked about specific actions that would get us there. Bundling all those up, like this is what we're going to have to do to be successful. And these set of like they are actions, but they're less specific to the link to the goals. They're more like cross-cutting. These are like the ways in which the plan will work. So I don't have the right words for that yet, but that's kind of what was bubble up in my line versus putting another different way of, looking at the plan. Although it does end up being like, it's super helpful because in some ways these kind of values or themes are more helpful in some ways because they are cross-cutting and are relevant across so many actions and back up to the objectives. So they are super important from an implementation standpoint, but they feel like they belong at that phase of the sort of processing of the plan.
Yeah, I like that. Janet?
Yeah, I was just thinking about how these themes interact with the pathways that are already articulated in the plan, and that my understanding was that those pathways and the objectives before them were distilled from past public comment from the inventory phase and the beginning of the planning phase. And so just wanting to think about like if that was distilled from public comment, then how do these themes interact with those? And in looking through these, and as Nick was talking there about some of these cross-cutting themes, like some of them feel like they are cross-cutting, and some of them feel just like different ways of wording the existing pathways. Like we have a pathway of promoting working lands. Here we have a theme on working lands. We have a pathway on outdoor recreation. Here we have a theme on outdoor recreation. We have a pathway on funding. Here we have a theme on funding. So I think just maybe teasing out a little bit more how these themes interact with the existing pathways would be helpful. And getting back to my earlier comment on just like helping people understand this plan and recognizing we have 3.5 months until a plan is due, and introducing another framework by which to try to organize things. I just wonder if it will have the intended effect of helping people understand it, or if it'll just make things more confusing in the end. So yeah, I just raised that as another concern.
And as you can see, that's a question we have, is whether this is additive or distracting.
Well, I guess on that point, yeah, because I'm almost wondering, is this helpful to help us tee up, like where do we want to do some really conservative, I guess, work, like in getting into the nuts and bolts of some of these topics to working out some more concrete recommendations for the plan? Or are we almost teeing up like we see these as potential working groups that would be like implementation working groups beyond the plan? I'm just kind of asking that as one thought, because some of these are pretty meaty topics, but I would like the idea of like us trying to, as quickly as possible, identifying some concrete discussion points within these themes.
Yeah. And
trying to like make progress on them. You can be willing to meet, longer hours on a couple of meetings to try and make progress, because I think, there's some important opportunities in the plan that we should be trying to like solve. Like there's a lot of questions right now around like what's the role of current use. We should have that conversation. There's a lot of questions around like what's the mechanism. Can we look at the phase 1 recommendation on wildlands or something else and try and find a solution there? What funding mechanisms can we lift up? And this question of like mid-sized parcels, like to me, these are all really important topics, and I know there's other important topics, but how do we get a more like boiled down list to really?
Yeah, I think focusing was a hope.
Yeah. Just Chris and then
I'll go first. So, couple things on the context setting. And this will also ultimately kind of relate back to like the solve the mid-sized parcel challenge and other things. Trying to figure out how to say this briefly, but I don't see I know we've recognized in the report, like, how much land is already permanently conserved, right? How close we are already to the 30 by 30 goal. But what I don't see in here is, and I'm deep into this, right, is me. I've got my humble 10 acres. I've been doing, stream buffer restoration, habitat restoration. As far as I'm concerned, I'm stewarding for biodiversity and habitat improvement. It's not just for me, right? There's their whole Vermont ethic about letting people access your land. And I feel like we just need to kind of come out and recognize that as a critical part of the context. Because, I don't know how many people here have lived in other states, but in terms of like existence of habitat and access to land, period. Not being constrained only to accessing, flagged public lands. Like when I would fly fishing, trout fish in New York, if I wasn't on a DEC marked stream, I'm probably going to get in trouble. And in Virginia, I'm damn sure not, because I'm probably going to get shot. But here, I can pretty much just wander the landscape. It's a pretty freaking remarkable place. And I just feel like we need to more explicitly call that out because I think that might actually help part of the conversation with like, where are we going with all this to the extent that, and then ultimately the role that just the individual landowner can play. And then I'm going to flip over to like the mid-sized parcel challenge and the land access and affordability and outdoor rec. It feels to me like just maybe we need to call out more of a, instead of, I know what the statute requires, but since we're supposed to look at all, more diverse strategies, like what can we do more around just kind of the individual landowner stewardship promotion? Like I don't know, maybe we haven't in Vermont, I've just not seen them, but in other states, right? You've got like land stewardship awards for farms and other things, right? And there's a sign on the mailbox or whatever. But is there some kind of like almost, I may have mentioned this before, but like almost like master gardener approach, where as communities, right, you stand up and we engage with each other. It's not just through the conservation commissions and other things. It's a more robust thing about, what can we do on our own property, no matter how big and how small, to be better stewards of this place, and approaches we can take towards conservation stewardship, allowing access, managing access. And it's not an overall yet another government thing that we got to do. And we're not asking towns to do shit. It's just what can we do as friends and neighbors? And I feel like that's kind of missing in here, but could be a really major initiative and frankly a cost-effective one. So I just wanted to put that out there as a possible thing to think about. I don't disagree with everything else that we've talked about, but I feel like we're kind of missing the average Vermonter in this thing.
Thanks, Chris. Krista?
To your point about public access on private land, and then also to Zach's point about data, one of the things that I heard in our Conservation Commission listening session was disagreement over the data on, all of Vermont's private land is getting posted, and the rate at which we are locking or we are cutting off access. I think that might be an interesting, let's figure out what the data says and let's add it to the plan so that we have some clarity there. And then that would also help inform the approaches that we take going forward. And then more broadly to these reflection questions, I agree. I wouldn't restructure the plan based on these themes. I think these are themes coming out of public feedback that's really useful, and I think they could help guide where we focus our like where we need to do some more work, kind of like Jamie was saying. And I agree with Nick that like maybe there's a way to weave them in that feels that's not overwhelming, but I would not at this late in the process restructure the whole thing.
Maybe building on that, I also think that we have heard throughout this process maybe a request for documentation of the conflicts and of the things that folks in our communities disagree with in this plan, or feel like have been left out, or maybe don't see themselves in this plan. And I'm actually wondering if this is the place also to call those things out, and that this is a side document that captures like, these are the places where more work is needed. These are the places where we weren't able to address important feedback from the community. Maybe this is the place where we can just start to build in like, well, what do we do with the criticism of this plan and with the contention around this plan, and like, who should be in the room to have those conversations as we move from the finalization of this into implementation.
There are 3 parts of the table of contents, and I know we didn't hand that out today. It's not really ready to kind of like fully dive into what scaffolds around that extended framework or the expanded framework document. But places that we were thinking about include like a executive summary, an implementation section that describes kind of what comes first, what do we need more resources for later, kind of the priorities of it. And then 8, to your point, Emily, sort of to organize the feedback that we've gotten to make sure that like as I said before, that the legislature has a record of both what, you know, our 5 questions that we've been putting out there. What excites you? What's missing, and what's unclear or you know, not working. So we want to be able to let the legislature know that too. So these themes could fit into any of those, but we definitely don't want to throw the whole framework out. We're just thinking about, you know, where there's, is this a way to do some plain language organizing?
I would also add, oh, sorry. I would also say that there are themes that have come up in our discussion today that aren't on here. Like the Act 181 thing is huge. It sounds like it's a really big theme. That should be on here.
Yeah, I was going to take all these posters from earlier and think about where we can add any of those. But if there's anything you see that you want to recall out.
Just looking at the question of how we can focus on short-term priorities and long-term priorities. I think in my mind, one thing that would help us a lot when it comes to the, you know, public enthusiasm and perception of this is some tangible wins on the board quick. And I think the focus in the long-term priorities, one of the things that we can get kind of bogged down in Act 59 in general is the like vastness and scope of it. And focusing hard on those short-term priorities, I think would be a win. I think we just gotta kind of put the buck on net a little bit, and have some demonstrable projects or some demonstrable programs that people can see and start to, you know, it's sort of like the long-term priorities will take care of themselves. We can use Act 59 to sort of foster an ethic that propels us toward those. But things like this talk of a fund to support easement costs for small scale easements that we were talking about last meeting, like stuff like that, when you can go to people at these meetings and tell them about that, the tone changes a little bit. And I think those short-term priorities and focusing on them right now, I think would be the way we ought to kind of look.
Yeah. And I mean, I think you can see here that we were thinking about this as a potential way of organizing priorities. So quality, like what you just named, and like that need to, it's a quality over quantity. It's also a gaps question. And so it slots in here in a couple different places. And we were thinking that we could build out those specific examples and lift up the elements of the plan that we felt were like most critical to proceed with in the short term, using this as a potential framing. I think if we were to say, let's not use this as an additional framing, or let's use it in a different way, we would then need to find a different way, I think, of doing that elevation work that I think people have been asking for all along, is to sort of, how do we highlight what's the most immediate way to do that tangible short-term thing? Like, this is the next step. Yes, we're doing 30 by 30, 50 by 50, but right now do this, this, and this. All the actions are important, but
and again, I would stress that we don't think that there are actions that are more important. No. Like some actions are important and they're priorities, and other actions are not really that important. We're not sure how to finesse and finalize all the objectives of pathways and actions. There's definitely room to hear feedback about that, what's missing, what's not clear. But if you think everything in there is important, then, you know, in terms of how we begin to prioritize and take action, it's like in the short term, like what's urgent or needful or kind of ready to go? Is it funded and capacitated? Are partners ready to work on it? And I'm just adding, because I like Alex's way of saying this, are there some easy wins out there that we want to get to right off the bat? And again, is this a way to organize how we talk about those? Like, what are the short-term wins and urgent things for quality? And then in the longer term, like those are the things that we need new programs, we need new funding, we need new people doing work, we need new community connections or collaborative agreements at the regional level. We want multiple strategies in place. We want that zoning plus temporary or short-term, long-term protection to then fit into in an integrated planning format, long-term perpetual conservation. So taking time to really think about that seems like a longer-term thing. It was just to kind of like, you know, instead of trying to be like, okay, what are the winners and losers within the framework? It's sort of like, how do we organize to communicate to people where we're going? But get your hand up.
Yeah, I appreciate the shift in framework or your framing that you're articulating here, and like engaging around using the TAC as a mechanism by which to help identify priorities and think through what are the short-term and long-term priorities that should be elevated in this plan feels like a really useful exercise that we haven't really gotten to yet, and I think would be good to get to. And then Jamie's point as well, like, and then what we've heard here today is we're all identifying some omissions or shortcomings that we haven't gotten to as a technical advisory committee or throughout the process. And it feels like some of those might also be a good thing for the TAC to weigh in on, of like, how do we dive into the UVA question? How do we balance these different values across the landscape? And so I just wanted to highlight, like, I appreciate the shift from the theme, focusing more on the themes, to identifying these as a way to prioritize the actions that are in the framework right now.
That's one reason why we were thinking about themes. The other reason was for storytelling up front. And then the last reason was for organizing and collectively presenting feedback, even though we'll try to do a more like encyclopedic feedback on like what people said about action 1.3, 2.1 or whatever. They're at least under the objectives and pathways organized comments, but a way to do a narrative description of what we heard around some important themes. So I think these would have multiple roles, or we could have different themes and different, but trying to use consistent concepts, consistent language, consistent ideas in the through line of the plan. So one thing to be thinking about as TAC members is like, what do you perceive as urgent? What do you perceive as, kind of funded and able to move forward? Where are the ready partners and collaborations? And what would the quick wins be? Go.
At some point in the past, like many months ago, we talked about whether we would ever rank any of the actions or priorities. And that is a can of worms. But I think there are people in the world who would appreciate a quantitative approach that sort of said, like, we're being really scientific and, structured around how we're prioritizing these things, because then on the back end, it's very defensible, right? It's like, here are the specific criteria we used to prioritize X. On the other hand, like, all of the feedback that we've been gathering over the past few months is really qualitative, right? It's what do people want? How are they feeling about things? And so I think there's also, there could be a argument to be made that a ranking system is not the most productive thing here, but I think it's worth considering, like, would we want to go through a prioritization exercise that somehow took into account all this feedback that we've been getting, and then the outcome was somewhat more quantitative? Is that useful to us?
And they're going to be ranked theoretically at some point in the process by the people doing the deciding on individual projects. So maybe us coming to them with some formalized way of helping them with those decisions would be useful.
And it's going to be, I think it's along the lines of what you're saying. There's kind of going to be the reality-based ranking about what's actually doable, right? I mean, once it gets. Can I ask a related question to that? So one of the things that you're talking about, like the scientific approach, one of the things I've been really curious about, and maybe it was part of the previous report, is has anybody looked at, is there research out there about, in the conservation world, about like the more kind of structured conservation, permanent conservation approaches relative to like stewardship initiatives, partnerships, and other things? I'm thinking like off the top of my head, I know there've got to be a lot in the East, but I'm thinking like out West, like where conservation organizations have worked with large landowners, and whether they're, a lot of cases private. I think there's also tribal examples, but like, as opposed to kind of easements and other things, more kind of, passive is not the right word. The word is just not coming to me, but it's like, but like where you're almost like these kind of landowner stewardship type arrangements, as opposed to like necessarily permanent legal structures, conserving land.
Practices, conservation practices.
I guess so. Yeah. Thank you. Sorry, I'm old and my brain doesn't work anymore. But Because to me, that would be, if we, I'm not saying we need to go off on a whole tangent there, but if it's easy, if there's an easy kind of literature search or something to kind of compare, like these kind of legal structural issues relative to practice issues and how durable both are over time. Because like I remember, this is different, but I remember like in the during the energy crisis in like 2008 and all the land that started getting pulled out of CRP and other things because they're going into biofuels, right? So land had kind of been assumed to be conserved. A lot of that stuff came out of CRP, WIP, and other stuff. So of course there were those moments in time, but generally speaking, are those things kind of more durable? I just put that out there.
You're reminding me, Chris, that I think going way back to when this was maybe still in the legislature, Eric Sorensen just threw out as a concept a table that had one access being conservation categories, not just the ones in the act, but things like UVA, private lands, stewardship, and then on another axis, different conservation values, which could be apples and oranges, like protecting natural communities, protecting trails, protecting working farms and forests, and then doing some, not really literature, but like you can sort of say like, these combinations work really well. And these combinations don't work as well.
Yeah.
And most of it is tied to the permanence and the ability to enforce different stewardship. And I think that was a really helpful table for me to see that and think about.
Like something we probably want to keep in our consciousness pretty near the top, because you pointed out the other night when we were at the roundtable, that I pointed out as part of our discussion that the conservation design isn't a plan for where to conserve, it's a plan for where to protect. And it imagines all those different forms of protections that you guys have been talking about, from voluntary to permanent legal conservation and ownership by a state agency. And anything in between that keeps it in its natural function and values, right? That supports its natural functions and values. So an important part of this. At the same time, the legislature was pretty focused in this act on permanent conservation and how to do more of that. So we've asked, where does that make most sense? Where's permanent? And that's something Bob and ANR have done, is say, from their perspective, that's what objective one is the places where permanent conservation makes the most sense for the values of VCP. But Ken, did you have a hand up a second ago? And then Jamie does as well, coming around the corner.
Yeah, I mean, Chris, your question, I haven't looked into the literature and would love to, because I think that's a really interesting thought. But just like my gut reaction would be that it just depends.
Yeah.
And like depends on the practice that you're trying to achieve and your conservation goals. It depends on the property and the location and the landowner. And something might a conservation practice might really achieve your conservation goal. And then 5 years down the road, the landowner sells that property, and the following landowner doesn't want to do it, or you permanently protect a piece of property, and but you maintain that parcel in forest condition, but one landowner maintains a higher quality than the following landowner, even though it's permanently protected. So I think so much of that really depends on the unique situation. I think, and my point being that one of the things I've heard from multiple groups here throughout this process and at this table is like we need a combination of it all, because it depends. We need to balance out what permanent conservation does really well and what values that protects, but also its shortcomings, and where other practices, what those practices do really well and how we can get those out on the landscape and engaging landowners and balance those things together across the landscape. So I've heard like, yes, we need both, but there's not a clear understanding of where, or like the scientific analysis that you're looking for.
I know I've got aware of a document or something I would immediately go to, except for conservation design itself, which is a pretty good document. Did you say the other night, and before you passed to Jamie, that you advise from TNC, you advise landowners on how to access permanent conservation, but you've also helped people with like enrollment in UVA, ESTA, or reserve category?
Yeah. One thing we do, I mean, we do permanent land conservation, but if somebody has in their forest management plan and or is enrolled in UVA and they have a forest management plan, but their parcel is eligible for reserve forest land or ESTAs, but they aren't currently accessing that and are interested in it, we help them access those tools that are.
I should say, I didn't say this, part of my context for bringing this up is at 90, probably 50% of my day is fielding questions. Where can I get money for this? Where can I get money for that? Right? Because towns are reaching out. And I don't know where this money is coming from. And all I see is the pools getting smaller and smaller. So that's what I'm trying to figure out. So my motivation for this isn't only like to maybe help it communicate better to like the average Vermonter looking at this thing, but it's also just like, I mean, things could change, but I'm just trying to figure out where do you get the bang for the buck in the absence of the cash? And we call that out, you know, one of the first things. And that's part of mine was reflecting on we're implementing this plan with fewer resources than anticipated. And so what is that lower hanging fruit kind of community stewardship type approach?
Picking up on a couple of great themes here. I mean, if there's time and capacity, I do think it would make sense to have like a big working group, like, you know, try and feed into this process so that we have more to work with. Down to that sort of at the end of the day, not all. And I think it was just great discussion on kind of the spectrum of like conservation opportunities. As I was looking back at Act 59 the other day, I was struck that, you know, it really does, it promotes identifying permanent, it identifies long-term mechanisms as part of the 50 by 50 goal, intermediate are asked for as well as part of like the inventory and the tracking and the conservation plan. So if you think about that from permanent to intermediate, there's a lot that can go into the plan that we could recognize. And in a way, I think if we could almost go back to like what Eric put together and round that out, because we haven't really talked about like what's the role of like deed mechanism, like a deed restriction, like how does that work? There's mitigation banking that's required through some of our land use regulations. Like, let's round out like our understanding of all the different mechanisms landowners are going to choose what works for them. And I think that would be really helpful as we kind of flesh out the opportunities there. Maybe we'll start to see where it comes together more.
I'm certainly interested in that kind of flow and discussion. It'd be an interesting thing to say, where do you start to feel like different actions begin to be what the legislature was specifically asking us to track versus things that will support the whole system, just in the same way that there's like viability work on the other side of this that maybe they're slightly beyond the scope of Act 59, but that supports it. So, you know, where does from voluntary, like A&R DEC has a lake-wise program that recognizes people with really good lakefront stewardship. And in lakefront communities where that takes off, people want to get that recognition. And it ends up, the social value of that ends up encouraging more landowners to do more than just follow the shoreline protection. And before shoreline protection, it was the best thing going for shoreline properties. It worked, except where it didn't, right? And so we want to be able to describe those sorts of things, but I don't think that's what the legislature wants A&R to track every other year. And I'm sure Gunner doesn't want to have to track every single different voluntary thing that's out there every 2 years and say, oh, well, you know, Krista's parcel got sold to Alex, and he took it out of crap, and you know, that's pretty tough to manage. So where do we start tracking, and while knowing that we have to do we want to continue to do all those things too. And who does, is it like the role of conservation commissions maybe? Like, can they help to focus communities on that full spectrum, but then also figure out how to tap into the long-term, durable, and permanent, you know, conservation mechanisms. Anyways, lots of good thoughts. Is there anybody on mine who's looking to come in, Annie?
I'm not seeing any TAC members with their hands up to speak. I know we do have another round of public comment coming, so there's some folks from the public who have their hand raised.
Okay. Well, why don't we? Is it okay if we shift to, Gannon, go ahead and let's shift to that, I think.
Just maybe on your last comment, Trey, I was just thinking about like, you're talking about how we track this and how we decide or narrow down what we track and what contributes and how we articulate that. And I know the Act just pulling up the act to look at the language, and there is the language in there on enforceable and accountable long-term protection mechanisms and measures, extending beyond like permanent protection to those other things, but it speaks to some of that accountability and enforceability. So I don't know if that seems to tie into to help Gunnar with his future tracking of this. That the act, the act was envisioning that a bit, that like we need some mechanism by which to actually be able to understand what is the impact on the ground, how is this helping needle or protect our values.
Yeah, thank you for that, Ken. All right, why don't we, looks like there's a few members of the public online, or it sounds like you, Annie, we call in people and then back you up with the chair. So let's do this now, and then we'll see if TAC members want to reflect one more time, and then we'll grab our lunch and transition to that last question for today.
So Kathy, I see that you have your hand raised. Would you like to try a comment or ask any questions?
Yeah, hi there. Hi, everybody. I'm Kathy Kingston from Westminster, Vermont. I've been on the Planning Commission and been involved with beaver habitat rehabilitation. I was very happy to hear about biodiversity, and have not been involved in this process very much, but I'm wondering about stakeholders. I'm assuming they have what they are saying and writing for you is being held in greater weight. Is that correct? As opposed to individuals from the public? That's a question for you.
Like, for example, if Rich hosted a meeting.
Fish and wildlife.
Oh,
for instance.
So, yeah, I mean, certainly the way the act reads, Kathy, is that VHCB will undertake this process and make recommendations in consultation with ANR. So VHCB and ANR's decision-making process is sort of distinguished. And then after that, you know, we've asked people to be part of this TAC because they represent whole stakeholder communities, and we really value that. But with a lot of individual Vermonter feedback that's very valuable, not just when lots of people are saying the same thing, but when, you know, definitely there's some very creative ideas or asks that we've heard that we're able to recognize as well. So I guess we're looking for all feedback. Especially
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was thinking about the biodiversity, and it's been brought up a few times in this meeting. And is there anybody speaking from the perspective, from the non-human perspective? Because I think it appears that you're getting everything, of course, from a human perspective, from Homo sapiens. And there are people, individuals in the state and organizations within the state, including Standing Trees, who have done a lot of work within themselves to hold the perspective of other species. And specifically, I want to address wildlife advocacy. I don't see any stakeholders that are purely wildlife advocates. Vermont Fish and Wildlife is definitely focused on wildlife utilization, not coming from the perspective of long-term health of other species. So that's a comment I want to put forward, is I would like to see more weight coming from the wildlife advocacy perspective, because that is not around utilization. It is not around, it's focusing on, particularly I'm thinking about Act 171 and the higher level, what is the word? It's escaping me, but, you know, species that move long distances, top predators. These are individuals who have been, their populations have been severely influenced by humans, and they're critical to the health of the system. And so that brings in issues of trapping, which is a non-targeted sport. Anyways, I'm just bringing in this whole, bringing in that issue into this whole, what you're trying to do here is let's think about other species and bring in a wildlife advocacy group to have more weight in this decision-making process is what I would like to see. And I understand there is advocacy coming within many of the stakeholders, but that's not their emphasis. And I think that's where I should stop with this comment. Any thoughts from any of you on this?
I'm gonna see if any TAC members want to respond to Kathy. Bob Zeno?
Yeah, Kathy, my name is Bob Zano. I'm an ecologist with the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, and I'm part of the TAC here. I'll just say that I hear your comments and appreciate your perspective. If you're not familiar with Vermont Conservation Design, which was led by the Fish and Wildlife Department, I'd encourage you to take a look at that. That's really about the department's perspective on maintaining ecological function across the whole landscape of Vermont at multiple scales so that we can keep common species common, protect rare species, and all their habitats. So if you haven't looked at that, I'd encourage you to take a look both at the reports about Vermont Conservation Design and then the implementing Vermont Conservation Design report that is being used directly in this process.
That's great. Thanks. Thanks very much, Bob. I'll do that.
And I'll just add, I'm Chris Campbell, Wyndham Regional Commission. You're in our region, and we're working with you guys on your town plan update. Wyndham Regional is hosting what's called a Regional Conservation Partnership. So feel free to reach out to Margot Gia on our staff. And this is about habitat connectivity and conservation. And then we're also active in the Vermont Staying Connected Initiative. And then we're also active in the Berkshire Wildlife Linkages project down in Massachusetts. So feel free to reach out to Margot on our staff if you have any questions specifically about like what we're doing at the regional level. I know personally on our land, I look at everything through the lens of brook trout. I figure whatever I do, if it benefits, not to catch them, but just like brook trout habitat, it like what makes them healthy. I figure anything that I do on our land is going to benefit multiple species. When I used to live in Middle Appalachia, I looked at everything through the lens of big amphibian called a hellbender. If it was good for them, it was going to be generally good for the forests and streams and everything else.
Thanks, Chris.
Right,
Jamie,
thank
find
you.
out what's going on.
Yeah, just Kathy, appreciate your comments and just recognizing that there's a lot of different, wide ranging sort of approaches to wildlife conservation and management, but just here on behalf of Audubon, Vermont, we're certainly trying to carry forward considerations around wildlife and birds as a local species, in particular habitat conservation interests. So happy to hear more ideas about how we can assist, but we're here trying to play.
So thanks. So I think it does sound like there are a few people who would be happy to connect from the TAC, Kathy.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just heard Kathy. Thank you, Kathy, for your comments. I'm not seeing anyone else with their hand raised anymore in the chat, but if there are any other members from the public who want to give comment, raise your hand or just go off mute. And I know we have Zach here and Rich too, so not seeing any others. So
Yeah, come on.
Standing trees, and thanks for the good conversation today. It's been, I think it's a really great discussion. I just wanted to chime in again with the framing. I think the framing is so important here. We're talking about a state that we all know and love, that we're trying to make sure our kids and grandkids get to enjoy in somewhat the same shape or better than we have it today, right? And we know that 75% approximately of our state is in forest today. Plus an additional amount perhaps in wetlands, water bodies. I struggle to imagine a Vermont that's a lot less than that amount of natural land cover. so to speak, right? And if we were, completely successful with this endeavor in Act 59, that would mean 50% of Vermont was in reasonably solid conservation. That leaves a quarter of the state of Vermont still with, requiring other means for maintaining the condition that it's in today or something better than what it's in today. I'm just bringing this up again because Act 59 it's a major endeavor. It's absolutely daunting in many respects, but it's also, I think, such a modest aspirational goal to just make sure that 30% of Vermont is permanently conserved. Another 20% is long-term, if not permanent, as Anne pointed out in the legislation. And that another quarter of Vermont is still, available for us to really have a hard discussion about what's the highest and best use of that land and how are we going to make sure that it provides the ecological function that we need. Bob is the best person in the room to answer this question. I can't remember. VCD, the map of the ecologically functional landscape, what percent of the state of Vermont does that cover in total?
The highest priority area is something like 70%, 68.
Just to be specific.
That's my point is that, right? Act 59 doesn't even get to the point of addressing, right, the full 70% of the ecologically functional landscape that VCD encompasses, right? And so I just think putting things in perspective and framing in these ways are so important. And for all the conversations that we're having, there is so much room for the agriculture, for the sustainably managed forest lands, et cetera. I just want to say one more thing. One of the questions that we asked our participants last night that I hope people hosting these gatherings will consider asking in the future for the listening sessions that remain, and that I hope that this group will ask when you have future comment periods is to zoom out a little bit. And what is your vision for Vermont in 2030, in 2050, in 2100? I'm a little worried sometimes that we're getting so into the weeds that we're forgetting that what this is about is making sure that we have species on the landscape that not only exist today, but in greater numbers, and also species that may not exist today back on the landscape. And so we heard from people yesterday, we'd like to see wide-ranging carnivores back on the landscape by 2050, by 2100. What are the pieces of our Vermont that are missing today that we want to envision? What's the big picture here? And I think that gets to some creative responses and some kind of visioning responses that I'm worried sometimes if we're just focusing on, the kind of nitty gritty of the plan that we missed out on. But I just we'll of course report that back in the summary of what came out of the conversation last night. But maybe just move it up for people who are listening. Thank you.
Can I respond?
Yes, I was gonna see if anybody wants to respond to either comment before we break.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. It makes me think about something Rich brought up at our last meeting, which was like that optimism and vision for what could be. It's just hard. It can be hard if like this is the only world I've ever known. So like, how do I begin to envision what it could be? And I think it's really good to like push ourselves to think about that. And I also think it's just hard. It's hard for people when they're trying to put food on the table and pay their electricity bills. And, I think there's that healthy balance. And so I really appreciate your point about like bringing in some more of that optimism. And that's definitely noted. So thanks.
We sounded a little bit of a somber note as we got started because people are feeling, you all reported this, we've been hearing there's some beleagueredness out in rural Vermont and just generally about all the different things that are happening that feel scary. Somebody said loss of local control, the feeling of all these different things piling up. So I appreciate that. That just seems like a great place to pause for now and say, like, as a reminder, is that there's a lot to be optimistic about. The journey that this TAC has been on has been a very optimistic, like, progressive vision in terms of people hearing and understanding each other and being able to really synthesize together. It's been really fun to watch and be part of. But then we go out to places that haven't had all the time to think about this and plan and come together. And there's a lot of work to do. And so if we're not optimistic about it, it's going to be hard to sustain that through an implementation period that's 25 years long. So some of us will still be doing the work. Some of us will be retired. And it's a multi-generational implementation period. So that's, you need a good deal of optimism and throughput and sense of community ownership to make that work, I would think. All right, so let's do pause there unless there's anything else people want to respond to from the public comment. Then
Kathy's got her hand back up there.
Okay, thanks, Alex.
Kathy, is that a new hand or maybe a raised hand that didn't go down?
Sorry about that. I just didn't lower my hand. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Alex.
That was a new term I heard in the pandemic for the first time, was a legacy hand. Legacy hands? It was. All right, so folks have brought food in for you all. Help yourself, anybody who's here. Let's take until 12:20 to maybe, refresh, use the loo, get some food. If you need to make a quick call. At 12:20, let's try to regather though, and we're gonna put one more question in front of you if you're not tired. You can also come back and say, Trey, let's just have popcorn and let's get ideas out there. So if that spirit moves you, please let us know. We want to talk about from here to like 2027. Like, how can we build and create throughput at least for the next couple of years? And that's lunchtime topic. So thank you. And we'll pause for people online. We're going to pause, or we're going to mute in the room for now so you don't hear us gathering food.
And for those who are still in the room while we eat our lunch, we just wanted to just take a little time as we are engaging in these stakeholder listening sessions out there in communities, having conversations, and hopefully building relationships, maybe building new relationships, building some community around this plan, thinking about how can we kind of take this momentum, build on it, reflect on it, and think about how can we move towards implementation and think about these partnerships as we move towards implementation. So we have some questions saying that can kind of help us kick off a discussion, but I was wondering if Chuck had some thoughts maybe that you could share as we get into the conversation.
Well, I don't know that I have any deep thoughts, but first I want to just acknowledge the thank you. Yes, we do all the listening sessions. Get conversation and lots of things for us. And just with a couple of reflections on the discussion just had. One is just, and it's something that Chris brought up that we've heard before, which is unless we can use what people would think of as jargon when we actually write an executive summary better. When I was young and getting trained about how to write, one of the tests was to give it to the grandmother. Remember. Recognizing that. I think our goal continues to be, and I think almost everybody's spoken to this in one way or another, everybody to see themselves in some way or another represented in this. We could be more than one thing at a time with conservation. Conservation is often a tool for rural community development, that is a tool for access, that is for biodiversity, and climate mitigation, And so I guess, we're in a difficult moment culturally, whole country. We have like each other. We can, that talk, makes it feel included. As much as it is, there is. Big left behind. So I hope listen sessions during the courses that we're writing up to it that really appreciate just your comments about the right now 181 and tier 3 and hopefully legislature will deal with that to some degree. It won't be quite the hot issue by the time we get to writing this report and getting it out to the public that it is right now. Because I think the convolution, what we're all doing here as things that are really voluntary and willing landowners, willing buyers, their goals for conservation, which almost all the time national space and conservation bonds, dollars, that's right. Very active. So we're all stopped.
Thank you for that. Yes, I appreciate that. And thanks for being here, listening to us today. So we once again have some discussion questions that I think can help frame up this conversation a little bit, but again, very much welcome whatever folks might want to share. And really, I think like this first question, what have we learned, is a good starting place, and what has worked, or maybe what hasn't worked. I think that's part of that conversation too. Again, as we go out into communities and talk about this plan and how do we build this momentum to move this group together. So very much welcome anyone to chime in. And again, if there's anyone on Zoom, I think we still have a few folks here with us, just raise your hand, I'll call on you. But based on the sessions that have been held so far, stakeholder-led, regional listening sessions, like what have we learned about kind of being in conversation with folks and what worked and what can be better? And Isaac, I don't know if you had anything that you wanted to share on this front too.
No, I think you're capturing it. I think one of the things we're thinking about is, we, based on, following the LAOB's recommendation to do these listening sessions, extra listening sessions, we're just drawing a ton of new people into the process. And so Alex, you were sort of speaking about earlier, the people are like, yeah, great. How do I engage? How do I stay engaged? There's a lot of new potential relationships and energy out there. And so definitely it's an opportunity to get feedback on the plan and to write the best possible plan we can, but it's also the beginning of a conversation and a relationship and an opportunity. And so what can we do to capitalize on that, in addition to obviously like getting all this wonderful feedback and reflecting it back to people? How can we sort of like build upon what the foundation that we're building?
I think like one thing that has worked very pointedly is getting people in a room together, and that's pretty clear. But conversely, what we've sort of seen not work is not getting people in a room together. There's like the misinformation around the intent of this, the like frustration that I got some of after our meeting is mostly born out of people just not knowing what we're trying to do exactly, or not having particularly good information. And that's been the case of every legislative thing I've ever been involved with in Vermont, is that like there's just the the Facebook space sort of like perpetuates some crazy thoughts and echo chambers that people just don't get like good, solid info on. And I think we got to fight that. And I wonder a little bit about the state's ability to utilize things like Front Porch Forum and, local advertising, whatever the case may be, like really get this information out to people. Because even among the subset, we've all sort of acknowledged that like we get a sort of a biased group of people that like decide to come to these meetings. Even among the like biased group of people that decided to come on a Tuesday night to Lincoln to hear us talk about Act 59, most people didn't know what it was. Like most people thought I was there to talk about Act 181. And this is people that were like care about this stuff. So like somehow, and again, Front Porch Forum is just sort of like one thought I have, but there have to be ways in this age to like get information to people more easily and directly than like hearing about it secondhand through their Facebook group, or whatever. I think that's going to be kind of critical in the public success or failure of this whole deal. The give a shit is there clearly. Like people, we've heard this loud and clear. Like the interest in conserving people's own land is there, and the interest in keeping Vermont wooded and as wild as we can make it is there. No, we just gotta get them the stuff.
And meet them where they are.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
This isn't going to be particularly helpful for the TAC, but the legislature's done a lot on housing and conservation and flood safety and everything. And I know we can't do, I'm just sharing that. I just, our town, everybody's just to your point, everybody's overwhelmed. All this stuff overlaps, right? For those of us who live in the policy world, we even I lose track sometimes of which one I'm talking about. Like, am I talking about the river corridor language in Act 181, or am I talking about the river corridor language in the Flood Safety Act? And I guess at some level, like, and I know our policy, our people here in the room who are primarily policy advocates, please don't throw things at me, but I kind of feel like we need to just take a beat or two and just let's work on what we've done for a while. I'm glad like the 181, fixes are going through, but I kind of feel like we just need to pause and let's implement what we got, because there's a lot out there to be implemented, and let that kind of work through the system right now. And also to your point, I don't know how we do this, but maybe as we go, and I'm not putting this on A&R, but since so much of this falls in your wheelhouse, I kind of wonder if we need like a one pager saying Act 181 does this, Act 59 it does this, just kind of no, but a lot of the processes, right? Because on the Flood Safety Act, a lot of that's in your wheelhouse, and this is kind of in your wheelhouse too. 181 is tangential with the LURB, but I mean, it's just somebody. It just feels like. I mean, we kind of do it at the RPC level, but we don't reach everybody. We primarily work with towns. But I am kind of wondering, it'd like benefit everybody if we can come up with like something that kind of differentiates between all this stuff. Maybe that's a really stupid idea and it wouldn't make any sense, but it is. But to your point, when we're meeting with folk, it's just everybody's just so confused right now.
Sounds like a combination of confusion, then also some like legitimate interconnections and at least the themes, even though they're very different statutory frameworks. And one is more about what should or should not be regulated, and one more about an opportunity for conservation and getting our state to a certain goal. They do touch upon connected themes, which I feel like I was picking up on that before this meeting, and today really kind of drove that home and hearing the feedback from the listening session. So I think there's something to what you're saying there, Chris. And while I'm speaking, I just wanted to put out there that we the Farm to Plate Land Access and Land Use Topic Exchange, which I'm a co-curator of, is hosting a listening session focused on agriculture and food system related issues as it relates to Act 59 this coming Monday. So if you haven't already heard about that, and Isaac and VHCB have been helping with that as well, 12 noon on Monday virtually, and I'm happy to send a link or help you guys connect with that. Love to see you there. Yeah.
Thank you all. Sorry I have to run. Good to see you all. And I just encourage that I know there's a lot of work going into the plan, and there's topics that clearly need more dedicated time, like whether it's how we do equitable set up equitable land conservation strategies or viable funding solutions, or sort of what are the other durable solutions that we haven't really even, discussed. So I do hope that there will be a capacity or a way for continuing working groups or whatever that looks like, and be eager to plug in as best we can. So thanks again for today.
Other thoughts? That was, thanks, Jamie. If you didn't hear Jamie on the way out, people who are online, he was just saying, some appreciation for the conversation, but also thinking that there's some hot topics and, other ways for the TAC to really get into those hot topics over the short term before we finalize that plan and recommendations. One thing I wanted to say from earlier, not to quibble with Gus, but you talked about a finish line. And there is a finish line of turning this plan and recommendations into the legislature. But then we'll take a day and we'll celebrate on July 1. But then on July 2, what do we want to come back to and pick up? Like what are things that just naturally are going to need more time to pick up, even if we've got a plan and recommendations that go into the legislature. Some of those recommendations are going to initiate new actions or processes, right? Some of them are like a discrete, like, we think you should do more of this kind of conservation, and here's how you could do it. And so we make a change in a policy, bada bing, bada bang. Other things are like, how can we gather the conservation commissions together and empower them and figure out strategies for simplified easements that bring more landowners in and more community involvement by in conservation design, so that there's a mechanism to protect smaller parcels, but it's still tethered back to the needs, the ecological needs and the community needs that are most important. Like that feels to me like a conversation that I, as a Cal, if I took maybe VHCB hat off, I as a Cal's Conservation Commission member, that's what I want to see continue to happen. I'd like there to be a conversation about resources coming to the local level, guided by regional guidance, guided by VCD, and then options for how to do stuff in our community, whether they're totally voluntary and educational, all the way up to what can commissions do, work with VHCD or ANR to protect important corridors or interior forests or connectors in our towns. So I had to get that out there.
Is the idea of like individual working groups around specific things, like Jamie mentioned, something that you guys are considering? It just seems like there's like a lot of expertise in this body that's sort of like, could be focused into a couple, areas where people really know a lot about, cook up some interesting ideas. That's obviously banking on folks having time and interest in doing so. But is that something you guys think about?
We had thought about having technical working groups sort of in the middle of this process, and instead we have these stakeholder listening sessions. Very different outcomes and very different, like one wasn't like, that's sort of where our capacity has gone for right now. Perhaps there's a way to maybe utilize that like lunchtime slot, like we had that 1 or 2, maybe like 1 hour lunchtime kind of working discussions. That might be something that we could do. We're a little tight on capacity, so it might be also something that like TAC members can help do as well, if there are people who would like to work with us for that. Gannon, were you going to mention something about that, or do you want to?
Yeah, I had a question because I think this starts, not specifically asked up on the screen, but it starts to get at the question, like, what do we do on July 1 after we get this in and after we take our day to rest and celebrate?
July 2.
July 2, okay. So, and that's something I've like heard batted around before, but really like that, I recognize the plan is important, but the plan is just a bunch of words on paper. Like the implementation is really where we actually see this plan through. And so I guess my comment was going to be just to I'd love to see in this plan, whatever the next draft is, some articulation for what the plan is beyond the plan. Like, what is the organization? What is the facilitation? What is the Vermont Conservation Alliance that is going to be put together to implement the objectives, pathways, and actions? And if that is 3 working groups or 15 working groups around the objectives and pathways, whatever that is, which sounds really scary because I know we're all burnt out in this process as it is, but
TNC was gonna lead phase 3 though, right?
yeah, we're stepping up. So yeah, but if there's some like organization, facilitation, continued collaboration, I'm running out of words that end in TION, around this plan, like that to me is really important to come through. And I think it gets at Alex's question of like what is that going to be? So the like the next version of the draft, I think that'd be a good
Can we throw that back out to you all?
Yeah.
What should be in that plan to implement this?
Well, and I was in a similar frame where it's sort of like the legislature, where the report gets delivered to the legislature, they pick it up and potentially do something on the basis of our recommendations. But then the entire conservation community, which I think is what you're pointing to, picks it up, and how they each pick it up is going to probably look a little different for each organization. And so I think, yeah, it's sort of like, it's almost like a question for the conservation community about what we want to do with this plan. And so I'm wondering, yeah, so I think it's in the same vein.
I guess
of like,
what I would suggest is that we shouldn't hand it out to conservation organizations and to all the municipalities and to the conservation commission, everybody around the state to say, here's the plan, take it and run with it. Like, I think if we are to make this of an efficient implementation, there needs to be some coordinated effort, whether it is TNC, ANR, ELT, VHCD. I know we're all hesitant to sign up for anything, but there needs to be a coordinated effort here, and it shouldn't just be each of us trying to implement this on our own, which I think is exactly what the plan is telling us not to. It's saying we've been doing this on our own for so long, and like we need to come together and have a shared vision and shared.
Yeah. And just to be clear, I think I was trying to say the same thing. Like the we that I was referring to is not every person that could possibly pick up this plan, but like the main land trust partners who have been doing the work to get us to 27% is sort of like us coming together and having that conversation together about how we launch out July 1st together as a community.
And let's make sure we are not continuing to do what is being perceived as a consolidation of power and decision-making and money in a very small group of organizations. We need to be thinking about who's at the table.
So yeah, I mean, it gets to, there are other questions in here besides just what we do in July 2, which is how do you maintain trust or continue to build trust where there's not enough yet? And how do we expand the community that sees themselves with concrete actions to partake of or to participate? That sounded pretty antiquated. To participate in the implementation of at that community level. So I think hopefully it will be really clear to ANR, VCP, BLT, TNC, people who work at the statewide level, that if we as statewide organizations aren't clear about what's next after we draft this, that seems very problematic. But if then others don't see themselves in it, we don't support the places that are maybe less likely to automatically assume and see themselves into it. I think trying to echo what I'm hearing Emily saying, what I'm feeling is that part of what we haven't done well is to work on those levels. I think the legislature they didn't say stop doing that or rededicate your energy away from that. They said enhance what you're already doing. That's what the plan is supposed to deliver. So we want to continue to do good statewide planning and thinking and conservation, but we also, I think we really have heard like local level, getting people involved across a variety of different strategies is like, that's something where there's some almost low hanging fruit of like, just if we can explain to people what's going on and what this means. There are a lot of people who are just need to be kind of directed or have the information to proceed.
We've also like really referenced a lot of other statewide plans in this plan, and some of those groups that are behind those plans are meeting to provide input. And I was at the Vermont Food Security Roadmap Coalition's meeting last week, and I think there's a real interest in a much deeper conversation between their work and the work we're undertaking now. And so I think some sort of plan for bringing those two groups together in a longer term way. And I'm sure that there are other plans, like we shouldn't just name them. We got to think about what that relationship looks like moving forward if we're hoping for real coordination.
Nope. Want to twist your arm. Thank you, Gus. Well,
Thank you very much.
we have 15 more minutes on the agenda, but it sounds like people are kind of getting their digested thoughts out there. And a couple of things, for TAC members to be thinking about, and we welcome any correspondence after today, is, continuing to think about this set of questions and some discrete recommendations. Like, if we thought some implementation working groups that were either theme driven or regionally driven would be helpful. Like, is that something people would like to see? Do we need, some better guidance documents and maybe some demonstration? Like, all those ideas that might be out there for people. Love to hear those in the next, while this is hot, in the next few days as you're reflecting on this. If you have 20 minutes to send an email with some additional thoughts. Also on the what we described as like the prioritization, which is not picking winners and losers, but being able to identify what's urgent, what's capacitated, where the partner's ready, and what's going to show people that we've been listening and responsive. Like, what are those first line actions, and then how do we walk and chew gum at the same time, and still have our eye on the long term, right?
One thing I'll just put out there is if I'm just not remembering what the structure of the plan looks like, but there's a municipal action section. Let's get into the details on that a little bit, because too often these plans talk about, towns should do X, Y, or Z. Then we create toolkits. But the problem is they don't have really, generally speaking, the vast majority don't have the capacity to use these toolkits. And so invariably they almost always call us, which is fine. I mean, that's what we're there for if we have the bandwidth to do it. We kind of need to be intentional about that stuff. So I'm just not remembering what we say in there about municipal actions, maybe beyond zoning and inclusion in town plan. Because frankly, there's things they can do right with like town forests and other initiatives around that. But we need to think about how you actually support them in doing that. So
that's just the tools they're used to using. Are there new innovative tools that
exactly, but
more complicated,
right? And so I guess I'm just saying. So instead of, we can just throw that stuff out there. That's fine, and then we can catch it up at some point. But if you want it to have meaning, I think it's not only towns can do this, but it's like, then I think under there, what is the technical assistance they need to actually make that happen? Call that out explicitly. Don't stop with the toolkit. Don't stop with the, what do they need to actually kind of get over not even get over the finish line, just even get onto the playing field. I'm not being smart about it. It's just increasingly, we're just kind of having to, and this isn't all about RPCs, right? There are a bunch of different partners, but we are kind of the primary go-to entity. And we just had all this discussion with the Vermont Evaluation of Rural Technical Assistance process that Gene referenced, and we just need to kind of call that out in some details. Otherwise, it's just going to be another, hey, towns, you should do this kind of.
Well, I think we had heard something very similar to that when we had brought you the first set of actions. And I do think that we retooled the municipal one to be oriented to RPC support and finding capacity there. But I'd be curious if you went and looked at that action in light of the conversations that you've been having.
Yeah, I'll go back.
Whether or not we fully landed it, or if there's something more there, because that's one of those devils in the details, and whether we got it right or not.
And where I'm thinking I want to look at that is like I do remember the RPCs are called out. I think we may need to flesh out a little bit more about why we're called out, because I don't think it's that's always, especially at the legislative level, I don't think they fully understand that. Right, just like town planning commissions, we're going to have turnover in legislators again, right? And so this thing's going to go out, and the legislators who pass this may not be the ones who are looking at it when it comes time for whatever the next steps are. I'm not making this about us. This would be the conservation districts and others, but let's kind of finesse that a little bit. I'm happy to that's why I'm here, is help with that.
There's an interesting ecosystem there of conservation commissions, planning commissions, regional commission. some of the watershed organizations that are sort of municipal, town, regional, and there is, I would say, as a planning commissioner, not a ton of clarity within that ecosystem about who does what and how. And there is, particularly on the volunteer-led groups, like a lot of turnover over time. And I know that our planning commission is really thinking about like, how do we have a stronger relationship with our regional planning commission and more direct communication between planning commissioners and the regional planning commission. And so I think like there's something there that is focused on regional planning commissions, but it's about that ecosystem and how those partners work together and are communicating with each other and working together that like needs some attention.
Wasn't there? So I brought this up last time, but at one point there was a pathway specifically designated to like that layering of conservation across municipal levels, regional planning commissions, conservation districts, statewide, regional. I think like it was trying to get at that we need actions and conservation buy-in and support at each of those concentric circles, and then also like interaction between them. And so I wonder, and I think that was merged into other pathways. And so I wonder like what both Emily and Chris are saying is that bringing back that pathway and really articulating that we need each of those levels and how those levels interact, it would be worthwhile to include in the plan.
I think this is one of the things, sorry, Trey, you were queued up. The work that we've been doing when we're providing our consultation role is really looking at how do we get to that first action that can help catalyze the success that we'll see towards those vision and goals. And I think the one about conservation at different scales, both on the landscape and in community, is one that we have queued up to talk about. Where can we make sure that this shows up across the different objectives? And how do we reflect it consistently so that it is getting at the actions that can be taken to catalyze success, where there's a recognition that the toolkit might not be the first action in all cases, but maybe looking to models that work really well, like Cold Hollow to Canada. What was their first step, and how do we create that first step through incentives or other actions?
We talked about this before, but I think sidebars that kind of talk about precedent, like, you know, so there's the plan language stuff. I know I've talked about this before, but then here's an example of that in action, Cold Hollow to Canada. And it doesn't necessarily have to all be in the plan, right? It's because this is going to reside online, right? I would assume. I mean, probably PDF, but you can link to something, right? I assume. So I'm sure there's all kinds of resources around Cold Hollow to Canada. But I think that's going to be, especially for the average reader, but even for the legislators, right? Because really they're volunteer citizen legislators. They're not deep in mesh, but I think really providing examples of what we're talking about here, and like what you were just talking about at even the planning commission level, let's call out a specific example of like, here's where the regional planning commission, conservation district, and other partners, like in our region, we work really well, almost seamlessly with the conservation district, Connecticut River Conservancy, Trout Unlimited, and then sometimes federal partners, and stitching all this stuff together. Often the conversation will go like, who's got the capacity to do what? I'll write the grant, we'll administer the grant, you know, we'll do this kind of thing. And just kind of, not that everything follows that model, right? But just like, here's a real world example of how that works. And to the extent that we can do that in the plan, I think it'll help it be more grounded and relatable, and less conceptual.
We had conservation at different scales at one point as one of the themes, and then we thought maybe we had reflected it in other places, but that just keeps coming up as sort of like, we want to see Vermont as part of the whole northern forest from Georgia to, past Cape Breton. And we also, as Krista was saying, we don't want to just see the little diamond of our town. We want to see how it connects to the other towns.
Yeah.
And we don't want to just see our own yard. We want to see how it connects through the stream corridor, the parcel next to us and beyond that. And so all through this, that notion that this is all connected it's implicit, but it bears teasing out, and it bears maybe even putting forward to this. It feels like something like an early action we could do is trying to figure out like, who's on first all around Vermont. But, you know, especially the places that haven't had somebody on first yet, like in Wyndham, your RCP is a really powerful organizing tool. There are counties that don't have any, just have everybody kind of growing in different directions. It doesn't have to follow the RPCs. And in fact, there might be some parts of Vermont where 2 or 3 counties really want to work together,
Yep.
Essex, Orleans, and Caledonia, maybe. And so that, you know, just figuring that out and then making sure that they are inclusive of those, of the communities and landowners across that region, which I'm sure you have a good model of. So that feels like something we could have a working group on. This notion of how to support all the different tools seems like something we could have an implementation work group on, you know, from voluntary to permanent. And then the other thing we have been hearing is, can there be a clearinghouse of information and like how-to information? Like, where's the TA? How do you apply for TA? How do you get feasibility money? Who has all the data? Like beyond Vermont Conservation Design, where can I go for data and science? Like that's making that available and consistently available to whoever, like whatever door somebody goes through, whether they talk to Gunnar or they talk to Chris or they talk to Rich or they talk to somebody at VCP, that we're all pointing back to some database that we keep together that describes opportunities and how to and that sort of thing. Anyway, we're a minute out. I'm wondering if there's any kind of final thoughts as we wrap up today, and then we'll yeah.
Maybe not like a good closing thought, but one other thing.
All the pressure's on you.
One other thing I know we had talked about at one point was like trying to articulate not like priority action, part of the plan, but we can talk to for each pathway or objective how a landowner could engage, how a municipality could engage, how an NGO could engage, how they could engage, and like try to tease out not necessarily in a priority action, but in just like, what does this mean for across these different levels? And that could be another way to carry that through line of multiple levels throughout the plan.
Yeah, somebody said that earlier, like having something up front that's like, if you're a landowner, this applies to you and you might be really interested in this part of the plan. If you're a municipality or a conservation commission member, probably these other things are. And if you're a statewide land trust, you know, maybe all of those things. But you know, it's something out there that speaks to different categories. It'd be hard to make sure we're not underrepresented as we do that. So how do we go back to the list of stakeholders from the act or what have you? But I think I thought that was kind of a nice idea, and that also would allow us to think about the throughputs for all those groups. Anyway, this is exhausting, but really energizing at the same time. I'm ready for a break, but also so appreciative of how much ground we covered today, and realizing that 3 meetings left feels a little daunting. So let's get back to you on maybe some offline ways to build space for people who want to come together and talk more about some of these hot topics to do so. And otherwise, we'll be supporting the regional listening or the stakeholders listening sessions for the rest of this month, and then really digging in April to what we've heard, cataloging and categorizing it. So in particular, if you have thoughts about how to categorize and catalog and that sort of thing, let us know. And yeah, I know you all are doing a lot beyond this and for this. So thank you very much.
Apologies for my 181 outburst.
No apologies are necessary from anybody for feeling a lot. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.
And TAC members in the room, the deal is 4 chairs or 2 chairs and a table. That's your ticket out of here.
Alex.
You can leave after putting only 3 chairs away, but
and 4 sandwiches.
you'll know. You'll know.